September 2nd, 1841, Robert Clay Allison was born on a small farm outside Waynesboro, Tennessee, and from the moment he arrived, his family carried the weight of poverty, hard work, and his twisted right foot. His parents, Jeremiah Scotland Allison and Mariah Brown Allison, worked thin soil with a few plows and guarded a small flock of sheep and cattle in the rolling timber and pasture along the creeks. The house was a plain log structure with a stone chimney, bare floors that stayed tracked with dirt, and a single room that filled with the sound of 9 children crowding one another. From his first steps, Clay dragged that clubbed foot over the packed yard, the misshapen ankle turning inward so that the leather of his shoe wore smooth on the side instead of the sole. The days on that Tennessee farm began in the dark when his mother stirred coals and his father stepped out to look at the sky and the low line of trees. Clay grew up in a world of sweat, cornmeal, and livestock noise, where the smell of manure and smoke hung under the trees almost every day. As soon as he was tall enough to carry a milk pail without spilling it, he trailed after his older brothers to the barn. The clubfoot slowed him, and when he lagged or stumbled, impatient hands shoved him forward or yanked him upright by the arm. Each shove pressed something harder into him. Neighbors who came by for sermons and Sunday singing at the Allisons' place saw a boy with a stiff stride and restless eyes who never looked fully at ease even when he sat still on a bench. Jeremiah preached as a Presbyterian minister and talked to his children concerning sin, obedience, and duty after the evening meal. Yet he also drove them hard in the fields. Clay learned early that a mistake with the plow or the stock brought quick correction, not just from his father's hand, but from the land itself. A missed fence repair meant a hog in the corn or a steer in the garden, and the whole family spent the next day fixing damage. When Clay was 5, the family center dropped out from under him. Jeremiah died suddenly and left Mariah with a house full of children, a patch of ground that always needed more work, and the constant worry of debt. Clay watched her shoulders tighten as she tried to hold everything together, and anger settled in him each time a neighbor mentioned his dead father in a soft voice that he hated. Somewhere in those hard years, he took a crushing blow to the head that left a shallow dent in his skull and set him on a more dangerous track. The story inside the family talked of a fall and a kick from a frightened horse that caught him high on the side of the head. Whatever the cause, the mark remained under his hair, a place where the bone dipped in. As he grew, that damaged place matched something in his mind. Fits of rage broke out of him without warning. One minute he would haul water from the spring and joke with a brother. The next he would throw the bucket, fists balled, teeth clenched, eyes gone distant. The other children learned to step aside when his temper rose. They had seen him tear into a sibling with sudden ferocity over a small insult and leave blood on a lip or a nose without showing any regret. The boyhood around Waynesboro gave Clay few places to put that violent energy. The hills and creeks offered long walks, hunting, and rough play, but farm work always came first. He drove cattle along narrow dirt lanes that turned to deep mud in the winter and dust in the summer. He chopped wood until his hands blistered, swung a hoe between corn rows, and shouldered sacks of grain despite the drag of his bad foot. Other boys mocked his limp when they thought he could not hear. When he did hear, the laughter did not last. Clay hit faster and with less restraint than they expected, and he kept hitting until adults dragged him away. Stories spread that he was dangerous when angered, and mothers in the area warned their sons not to push him too far. The community around the Allisons watched him grow taller, broad in the shoulders, and marked by that uneven gait. In church meetings and gatherings at neighboring farms, Clay stood near the wall or the door and spoke little unless pressed. He gave the impression of a young man who could be courteous when he chose, standing straight, hat in hand, voice low and respectful, yet who carried a tight coil of hostility just under the surface. A few older men tried to steer him toward patience and restraint, talking with him concerning self-control and the importance of keeping his word instead of his temper. Those talks never lasted long. Clay listened without expression, nodded when expected, and then did exactly what he wanted the next time someone crossed him. By his late teens, national events reached even that out-of-the-way farm. Political arguments over states' rights, secession, and slavery moved along the roads with travelers and newspapers. At crossroads, stores, and outside small courthouses, men gathered around crates and benches to argue over speeches by Southern leaders and Northern politicians. Clay heard those arguments on trips into town with wagon loads of produce. War hung in the air long before the first shots. When the fighting finally began in the spring of 1861 and Tennessee moved toward secession, young men in Wayne County treated enlistment as a test of courage and loyalty. Pressure built on every able-bodied male, and a clubfoot did not excuse a man in Clay's mind or in the minds of his neighbors. In October 1861, he enlisted in Phillips's Tennessee Light Artillery, sometimes called Jackson's Battery, and entered Confederate service despite his physical defect. The Army examined him, saw the limp, and took him anyway. At Camp Maury near Nashville, he tasted military life for the first time. The camp stank of latrines, sweat, and wet canvas. Cannon rolled in and out under shouted orders, horses strained at, traces and drill sergeants walked lines of recruits who knew nothing yet of real battle. Clay learned to sponge and ram a gun, to move limbers, to handle ammunition, and to work in precise teams where an error could cost limbs instead of crops. The closeness of that work and the noise of firing set his damaged nerves on edge. Fellow soldiers noticed that sudden noise or strong emotion brought violent outbursts from him that did not look like ordinary temper. His time in that artillery unit did not last even a full season. Army doctors studied him after repeated episodes in which he threatened superiors or fell into convulsive fits during moments of stress. The medical officers wrote that physical or emotional excitement brought on spells they described as part epileptic and part maniacal, and they judged him unfit for that kind of service. After only a few months, they discharged him on grounds of mental disability tied to his old head injury. The order said he could not safely remain in the battery. Clay left camp with rage burning in him at the humiliation of being sent home not as a wounded hero, but as a man the Army considered unsound. Back in Wayne County, he returned to the same fields and chores. Corn still needed hoeing, fences still needed repair, and livestock still had to be fed. The war, however, colored every conversation and every day. Companies raised from nearby counties marched past on dusty roads, drums beating, flags carried high. Men who stayed home felt the eyes of neighbors on their backs. Clay carried a discharge paper that explained why he had come back so soon, but every time someone mentioned it or hinted that he had avoided danger, his temper flared. Talk of his discharge as a madman spread along with tales of his strange spells, and the sense that he had been branded for life as unstable deepened the anger already coiled inside him. Months passed, casualties mounted, and news of federal incursions into Tennessee reached even isolated farms. Clay watched brothers, cousins, and friends ride off to join cavalry and infantry units. He heard stories of successful raids and celebrated officers who made daring strikes against Union forces. One name, Nathan Bedford Forrest, stood out in all that talk. Forrest commanded cavalry that hit hard and fast, often with limited support, and many in Tennessee praised him as the sort of leader who never let an enemy withdraw unpunished. That reputation appealed to Clay. He turned the humiliation of his discharge into a determination to re-enter the fight, in a role that fit his aggression and his skill on horseback. On September 22, 1862, he re-enlisted, this time in the 9th Tennessee Cavalry, a regiment that served under Forrest. The recruiting officers did not turn him away. The need for men and horses overrode earlier concerns, and Clay presented himself as strong, capable, and eager for combat. Once mounted, he handled a horse with ease despite the bad foot. Years of riding among rocky Tennessee hills and working livestock had taught him balance and subtle control of reins and legs. In the saddle, he did not look like a cripple at all. The cavalry gave him speed, mobility, and an outlet for the violence that had no safe place on the farm. Life in the 9th Tennessee Cavalry was a constant cycle of marching, scouting, raiding, and fighting. The regiment crossed rivers, moved through woods and fields by day and night, and hit Union outposts, wagon trains, and isolated detachments whenever orders sent it forward. Clay rode in tight columns along narrow roads, slept in wet blankets under trees, and woke to the sound of bugles and shouted commands. Rain turned trails into deep mud that sucked at hooves. Summer heat baked men in wool uniforms until salt crusted their collars, and winter clipped through thin coats during long picket watches. In that harsh environment, his clubfoot and head injury might have slowed or broken another man. For him, hardship and danger fed the unstable fury already inside. Forrest's raids into Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky put Clay and his comrades into brutal close-range combat. Cavalry charges closed the distance between men fast. Carbines, revolvers, and sabers did their work at a few yards or less. Clay rode past scattered Union dead on dusty roads, saw wounded men groaning in ditches, and watched prisoners herded away with hands raised. He also watched Confederate casualties mount, men from his own regiment falling from saddles or lying beside broken horses. Reports from those around him describe a soldier who showed little visible fear. He pressed forward in skirmishes, pushed his horse toward the thick of the fight, and cursed officers when they ordered a withdrawal instead of a pursuit. His volatile temper that had shaken the artillery unit surfaced again in the cavalry in more personal ways. Officers heard him threaten superiors who hesitated to chase a beaten enemy. Fellow troopers saw him snap from joking calm to wild fury when something checked his desire to press an advantage. The same nervous system that produced convulsions under strain in camp now drove him toward extreme action in the field. He did not break in the sense of refusing orders or collapsing, but something in him tightened with every skirmish and raid. The combination of brain injury, unrelenting stress, and easy access to weapons grated against whatever restraint he still possessed. By 1864, the 9th Tennessee Cavalry had ridden through enough blood and hardship to harden every man still in the ranks. Clay lived in a world of sudden death, burning supply depots and ruined farms. Union counter-raids brought destruction to Southern civilians, and Confederate raiders returned ruin in kind. A pattern of vengeance took root in the border counties. Clay carried that pattern inside him. Accounts from those who rode with him describe a man who carried out orders against Union soldiers with a cold efficiency, yet whose eyes sometimes took on a distant, flat look during and after a fight while his hands continued their work. The last months of the war pushed him and his comrades through a long series of retreats and holding actions as the Confederacy crumbled. The bold raids of earlier years gave way to desperate efforts to slow advancing Union forces. Food grew scarce, horses weakened, and the men in the saddle felt the strain of fighting for a cause that stood under mounting pressure from every side. Clay saw friends captured, wounded, or killed, and his own rage deepened. The mixture of personal injury, early loss of his father, and the grinding collapse of the army that had given him purpose left his mind in a dangerously frayed state. When General Forrest surrendered his cavalry command at Gainesville, Alabama on May 4, 1865, Clay stood among the men who turned in their weapons under the terms agreed upon with federal authorities. 6 days later, on May 10th, he received his parole and walked away from the war as a free man on paper. The The government marked him as discharged and pardoned. The violence that had marked his childhood temper and his wartime service did not receive any such release. It rode home with him in the same body that carried the dent in his skull and the crooked foot, ready to spill over into the broken world of Reconstruction Tennessee that waited beyond the camp. Late 1865 to 1869. The ride back from Alabama carried Clay into a Tennessee that no longer matched the country he had left when he first put on a gray uniform. Military posts dotted the roads. Blue uniforms moved in and out of makeshift barracks and courthouses and warehouses, and fields that once held corn and cotton lay choked with weeds. When he stepped down on familiar ground in Wayne County, his mother was older and thinner. His younger siblings more guarded in the way they watched him. And the old place bore the marks of war and broken fences, missing stock and tools worn past their proper life. Clay carried a parole paper in his pocket and a set of habits formed in cavalry service, and the two fit badly together. Peace did not calm him. The restless tension that had driven him forward under Nathan Bedford Forrest still kept his muscles tight and his jaw clenched when the days should have been quiet. At the farm, work resumed in the most basic sense. There were still hogs to feed, horses to care for, and ground to scratch with what implements the family had managed to keep. Clay moved through those chores with the same forced economy he had shown in camp. Yet his movements had a different edge now. The old injury in his skull pulsed when he bent to lift a sack or swung a tool, and flashes of rage came faster than before. A careless word from a brother, a gate left unlatched, or a minor accident with a wagon could bring him to the point of striking out before anyone nearby fully understood what had triggered him. Tennessee under federal occupation added fresh fuel to that temper. Soldiers in blue stopped men on country roads to demand papers, searched wagons, and checked for weapons and contraband. Federal officers and agents of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands opened offices in county seats, taking over buildings that once housed local government. Freed people lined up outside those offices to negotiate labor contracts or seek rations, while white landowners waited sourly for their turn to argue concerning taxes, titles, and the status of their fields. In Wayne County, as in much of the state, resentment boiled around that bureau presence. Clay watched from the edge of courthouse crowds, taking in the sight of federal agents writing at tables while armed guards stood nearby. And former slaves spoke concerning wages and rights in voices that carried across the yard. The changes cut against everything he thought the war had been fought to prevent. He would ride home from town with his shoulders bunched and his mouth clamped shut, then slam through the farmhouse door, throw his hat down, and pace the room as if looking for an enemy. His mother tried to remind him that the family needed calm more than they needed one more angry fighter. Her words slid off the hardened man who had come back from cavalry service. Sleep did not always come easily. On some nights he would walk out to the edge of the property and stand in the dark, watching the faint glow of campfires from distant patrols or towns and gripping his rifle as if the war still ran in the timber. In that tense atmosphere, ex-Confederates organized themselves into secret groups that promised to defend what they called their way of life. In Wayne County, Clay did not stay on the margins of that activity. Residents and later investigators identified him as one of the veterans who joined the local Ku Klux Klan chapter. Meetings took place in wooded hollows and abandoned buildings away from the eyes of bureau officers and Union troops. Men he had known from cavalry companies and farm neighborhoods arrived in plain clothes, pulled on robes and hoods, and sat in circles lit by lanterns where oaths were recited and targets discussed. Clay fit into that structure easily. It offered a familiar chain of command, midnight rides instead of raids ordered from a military headquarters, and enemies that matched the anger he had carried home. Riders from that chapter moved at night along the same back roads where he had trailed cattle and marched to church in younger years. Hooves thudded on dirt lanes and bridge planks rattled under groups of horses headed toward cabins where freedmen lived or to houses associated with Republican activists and Bureau allies. The Ku Klux men delivered warnings, destroyed property, and used beatings and threats to try to shut down what they saw as federal interference. The Freedmen's Bureau files from Tennessee recorded assaults, arson, and intimidation in counties like his, reports framed in the formal language of outrages, riots, and murders that did not capture the raw fear left behind in households that heard horses stopping outside after midnight. Clay rode on some of those nights, the white hood hiding his face but not masking the fierce energy that had marked him since boyhood. There were moments when confrontation came close to breaking into open battle. Accounts of the time describe how hostility between the Wayne County Klan riders and local Bureau representatives nearly produced an armed clash. Teams of masked men watched the approaches to the Bureau office, and Bureau agents moved with increased caution, often under guard. Clay remained near the center of those tensions. Men remembered him sitting a horse with easy balance, weapon within reach, eyes fixed on the courthouse square or on the road where federal officials passed. He did not control the entire organization, but his reputation as a man who would push a situation toward violence if challenged helped give weight to every threat delivered in his presence. Stories from that period grew even darker as they spread. One tale that circulated in later years described a visit from a Union cavalryman who arrived at the Allison farm with orders to seize property. According to that account, a confrontation in the house ended with a shattered keepsake and Clay walking out behind the departing soldier, with a rifle in his hands. The story concluded with the federal trooper lying dead on the road and a hurried burial in a corner of the property. Official records do not resolve that claim, yet the fact that neighbors repeated it for generations showed how easily people in the region believed him capable of that kind of sudden killing. The tale joined other accounts of his post-war conduct and deepened the sense that the war had not really ended for him. Even without that disputed killing, the pattern of his days made it clear that the line between war and peace had eroded inside him. Arguments with former Unionists or with men who tried to adapt to the new order could shift in an instant from raised voices to drawn weapons. Clay seldom backed away. He carried a revolver and knife as naturally in civilian clothes as he had in uniform and saw no reason to surrender the authority that came with being willing to use them. Where other veterans in Wayne County tried to rebuild farms, open small businesses, or enter local politics, he leaned into the identity of a man whose value came from his readiness to do violent work. The economic realities of Reconstruction pressed on the Allisons at the same time. The land that Jeremiah had farmed did not recover quickly from wartime damage and the disruption of markets. Taxes weighed more heavily in a system reshaped by federal policy. Opportunities for young white men in that part of Tennessee narrowed as freedmen contracted for labor and as capital shifted toward other regions. Stories reached Wayne County of open ranges in Texas, where a man with nerve and skill could hire on with cattle outfits, ride long trails, and carve out a new position in a society built around livestock instead of small plots of exhausted soil. Clay paid attention when such stories surfaced in town or around campfires. Names like Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving began to circulate, attached to accounts of herds driven from Texas toward markets in New Mexico and Colorado. The thought of riding guard on thousands of longhorns across wild country appealed to a man who felt caged by the crowded hills and supervision of occupying troops. The cattle business offered money, movement, and a place where personal courage and a willingness to fight still mattered. It also promised distance from the Bureau offices, night riders, and tangled grudges of post-war Tennessee. Inside the Allison family, the idea of leaving turned from talk to planning. Clay's brothers Monroe and John saw the same limits on their future in Wayne County. Their sister Mary and her husband Lewis Coleman weighed the risk of uprooting themselves against the real prospect that staying would mean years of conflict with federal authorities and hostile neighbors in a county still under scrutiny. They knew that taking Clay into a new country would not change his nature, yet the chance to rebuild fortunes in a place where his temper could be directed against rustlers and trail problems instead of federal officers had its appeal. The preparations for departure underscored how thoroughly the war and its aftermath had stripped the family. Wagons were loaded with what tools, bedding, and household goods they could spare. Items that had once seemed important but now slowed the move were sold off or left behind. Livestock that could not be driven all the way west went at low prices to neighbors who stayed. Clay helped with the work of packing and hitching teams. Yet on some days he stood aside, leaning on a fence post and staring toward the road, as if already riding ahead in his mind to the vast plains he had heard described. When the small caravan finally rolled out of Wayne County, the tracks of their wheels marked not only a change of address but a break with the tightened network of loyalties and grudges that had formed during the war and Reconstruction's first harsh years. Clay rode on horseback alongside the wagons, rifle laid across his saddle, the irregular step of his damaged foot hidden by the smooth movement of the animal under him. They passed through towns still scarred by conflict, crossed rivers where bridges had been rebuilt or improvised, and camped in fields where other emigrant families settled in for the night around low fires. In those camps he kept his distance from strangers, watching from just outside the circle of light with the same guarded attitude he had shown around bivouac fires in the army. One of the most charged moments of that journey came when the family reached a wide river crossing operated by a ferryman named Zachary Colbert. The man controlled a key point on the route west and charged what he believed the traffic would bear. Clay treated the posted rate as an insult. Voices rose on the bank as he accused Colbert of gouging travelers already burdened by the cost of uprooting themselves. The dispute escalated from words to blows. Witnesses later recalled how Clay closed on the ferryman with the quick, brutal efficiency he had used on opponents since youth. When he was done, Colbert lay beaten and unconscious on the riverbank, and the crossing took place on terms that suited Allison rather than the man who owned the boat. The incident would echo years later when a relative of that ferryman came looking for satisfaction. But at the time, it simply added another episode to Clay's growing record of settling grievances with his hands and weapons. The farther the wagons rolled from Tennessee, the more the landscape opened. Timber thinned, horizons stretched, and the family moved into a country where grass, sky, and distance dominated every direction. By the time they reached the Brazos River region in Texas, they had left behind bureau offices, clan gatherings, and the specific faces tied to old quarrels. Clay had not left behind the temper, the habits, or the comfort with bloodshed that Reconstruction had sharpened. The man who rode into the Brazos country was a former cavalry trooper whose post-war years in Wayne County had taught him that killing could be used in disputes off the battlefield as easily as on it, and that belief now traveled with him into a wider West built around cattle, guns, and the thin presence of formal law, 1866 to early 1870. The Brazos River country in Texas spread in long rolls of grass broken by scrub and low timber when the Allison family pushed their wagons into it. The river did not glide clear and gentle. It moved brown and thick, edged by cut banks and tangled brush, and it set the rhythm for the ranchers who tried to use its water without losing stock in its sudden rises. Clay stepped down from his horse into that new country with the same crooked right foot and the same scarred mind he had carried out of Tennessee. Hard sun, open range, and the cry of cattle replaced the close hills and bureau offices. But nothing inside him had softened. He watched the cattle herds on the horizon and the scattered camps along the Brazos, and saw a place where force still counted more than paperwork. Work came quickly. The war had left Texas full of half-wild longhorns and short on money. Men who understood cattle tried to turn loose stock into cash by driving herds toward markets in New Mexico and beyond, and they needed hands who could stay in the saddle and hold a herd together for months. Clay hired on with outfits that grazed along the Brazos, roping, branding, and breaking horses. He rose before daylight to the sound of cattle lowing and iron banging against pots, pulled on sweat-stiffened clothes, and swung into the saddle while the air was still cool. His bad foot made walking awkward, but mounted he looked at ease. A horse gave him speed and confidence instead of limping strain. On the ground he carried hay hooks, branding irons, and ropes. On horseback he carried a revolver and often enough a rifle across his thighs. Not long after settling near the river, he signed on as a cowhand with Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving. Those cattlemen gathered longhorns and pushed them toward forts and reservations to the west and north. Drives formed in the Brazos country, herds thin at first, then swelling as more animals were cut out from scattered ranges. Clay rode drag, flank, or point depending on what the trail boss ordered. Dust rose thick from hooves, turning every man and animal along the rear of the herd the same dull color. The sound of thousands of hooves pounding dry ground ran through his bones day after day. At noon the sun burned through hat brims and dried sweat into white streaks on shirt fronts. At night the herd bunched and shifted while men on night guard rode slow circles, humming or talking to keep the cattle calm. On those drives, Clay showed why ranchers kept hiring him. He could stay in the saddle through 16 hours of rough work without complaint, handle a rope with precision, and move fast when cattle broke. When a clap of thunder rolled across the plains and a flash of lightning jolted a bedded herd into motion, he jammed his hat down and spurred into the dust and noise, yelling and firing shots in the air to turn the lead back on itself. Longhorns crashed against each other, horns clacked, and the ground trembled. More than one hand flinched at the risk of being caught under tumbling bodies. Clay rode into that chaos with his jaw clenched and his eyes bright, swinging his horse across the lead and forcing the animals into a tightening circle until the stampede slowed. When the herd finally settled, the others heard his harsh laugh cut through the pounding of their own blood. For him, danger felt familiar. When the herd stood quiet again and campfires burned low, a different kind of trouble often surfaced. Long days in the saddle and thin trail rations left men irritable. Cards and whiskey and makeshift camps near waterholes turned that irritability into fistfights. Clay did not avoid those nights. He came off guard duty, stripped off his trail gloves, and stood over crude card tables made from planks laid across kegs. He drank hard, watched other men's hands, and let small insults pass until one hit a nerve. A word concerning his discharge, a joke concerning his limp, or a stray remark that hinted he had lost nerve was enough to flip him from watchful silence into violence. He would slam his palm down on the table, scattering coins and cards, then drive his fist into a face before the insulted man had fully stood up. When others stepped in, he did not back away. Boot heels slipped in dirt as bodies crashed against wagons and firewood piles. Knuckles split. Blood ran from noses, and Clay kept hitting until someone stronger or more sober dragged him off. Despite those eruptions, trail bosses valued him. He did not shirk guard duty, shirk night rides to check the outer edges of the herd, or complain when rains turned the ground into sucking mud. During river crossings, he pushed his horse into cold brown water beside bawling cattle, helped steady swimming animals by grabbing horns, and shouted at younger hands who hesitated near the bank. At one crossing of a swollen branch of the Brazos, a steer lost footing and rolled toward a panicked rider whose horse had frozen near the drop. Clay drove his own horse in, shouldered between the steer and the trapped animal. and cracked his quirt across both beasts' ribs until they clawed their way to footing again. When it was done, the younger cowhand tried to thank him. Clay cut him off with a flat statement that any man who froze in a crossing would answer to him before he answered to any boss. The words carried threat, not reassurance. Around 1867, he worked as trail boss for M.L. Dalton, a man who trusted him to keep crews in line during long pushes north. As trail boss, Clay rode the length of the herd, checking positions, counting remudas, and inspecting gear. He assigned men to night guard and expected obedience without argument. A hand who wandered away from his post to flirt in a way station, or who fell asleep in the saddle while cattle shifted in the dark, met a sharp rebuke. In one camp, when he found a guard slumped behind a wagon while the herd stirred restlessly under a low, moaning wind, he dragged the man to his feet and slapped him open-handed across the face in front of the others. Then he jammed the guard's hat back on his head and shoved him toward his horse with a warning that if the herd broke once on that man's watch, there would be no second chance. The guard understood that the threat meant more than a tongue lashing. Between drives, he worked for his brother-in-law, Lewis Coleman, and rancher Irwin W. Lacey, men who were building up stock in that region. Their spreads stretched along creeks that fed the Brazos. Corrals and crude bunkhouses rose beside wagon tracks. Clay rode fence lines, checked water holes, and watched for sign of cattle thieves. The environment bred tensions over land, water, and brands. Trails to ponds and streams cut across overlapping claims. When strange cattle appeared near Coleman's or Lacey's ranges, Clay rode out to study brands and earmarks. If he judged that someone had slipped animals off his employer's range and turned them in with a neighbor's herd, he did not always go through sheriffs or courts. He rode to the neighbor's camp, pointed at the offending stock, and demanded explanations with one hand resting on his revolver grip. Those talks seldom stayed polite. Stories began to circulate along the Brazos concerning his readiness to settle disputes with weapons. In one quarrel over access to a water source, witnesses saw him step down from his horse, knife in hand, and draw a line in the dust with the blade point while he laid out terms. The neighbor facing him watched the knife, the revolver at his hip, and the hard stare in his eyes, and decided that argument over words meant less than walking away alive. The range community took note. From that point, when Clay rode into a camp, men watched him with the alertness they normally reserved for strangers. They knew his history of night rides in Tennessee. They knew he had ridden with Goodnight and Loving and had not broken under stampedes or storms. That reputation carried moral weight on the open range. He had, however, no talent for letting grievances cool. If a hand mocked him in a line shack, the remark rarely faded into forgetfulness. He would sit still, eyes on the fire or the floor, while talk moved on. Hours later, as the camp grew quiet and the wind worked at the canvas of the tent or the loose boards of a bunkhouse wall, he might rise, walk over to the offender's bunk, and strike without warning. A fist in the face, a knee driven into ribs, or a boot heel slammed into a shin served as his reminder that the earlier insult had not gone unnoticed. The man on the receiving end understood that the trail boss or ranch owner held some authority, yet Clay enforced his own separate code that turned small slights into extended feuds. Towns along the routes where cattle outfits resupplied saw the worst of his drinking. In Brazos, settlements made of rough board fronts, dance halls, and narrow alleys, cowhands poured into saloons after months of restraint on the trail. Clay reached those doors with his throat as dry as any of them and a temper already shortened by dust, hunger, and long hours. Inside, the air pressed hot and thick with smoke, sweat, and the sour tang of spilled liquor. Music from fiddles and banjos fought with shouts at card tables and the thud of boots on plank floors. He drank fast, leaning on the bar with his hat pushed back, and scanned the room. If local men tried to push trail hands away from better tables or from women, he stepped into those disputes, not as a peacemaker, but as a man eager for a clear line between victors and losers. Glass shattered, chairs flipped, and pistols scraped out of holsters as brawls erupted. On more than one night, he walked back into the street with blood on his knuckles and someone else groaning on the floor behind him. The violence stayed just below the threshold that brought hangings or long prison terms. Trail bosses and ranch owners needed him too much to let local law drive him out. They paid damages for broken fixtures, settled with saloon keepers, and spoke to sheriffs concerning the value of keeping herds moving and payrolls coming through town. Clay never thanked them. He treated such interventions as confirmation that the world worked the way he understood it. There were men who commanded respect because they stayed calm, and there were men who commanded it because others knew they would hurt anyone who challenged them. He planted himself firmly in the second group and saw no reason to shift. By early 1870, Coleman and Lacey looked beyond the Brazos toward New Mexico. Word of open grassland in Colfax County with access to the Vermejo and Canadian rivers reached their camps. They studied maps, spoke with travelers, and measured their chances in a region where land could be taken up and stocked without the same density of neighbors and old claims that crowded the Brazos. The plan that formed called for a movement of herds and families north into that country. For Clay, the prospect fit neatly into his pattern. A drive into New Mexico offered more trail work, more risk, and new territory where his name did not yet carry the full weight of his temper. While Coleman and Lacey assembled cattle and wagons, he checked saddles, counted ammunition, and sharpened blades, preparing to ride with them into a region where the lack of settled law would give his violent impulses even wider room. Fall of 1870. By the time the herd out of Texas reached northeastern New Mexico, the grasslands of Colfax County spread in pale waves from the timbered ridges down toward the Canadian River and the Vermejo. New frame and adobe buildings clustered along the road at Cimarron and Elizabethtown, but most of the country still belonged to wind, cattle, and scattered ranch houses. After one of those long drives, payment came not in coin but in cattle. Clay and his brothers took their share, cut them out of the larger herd, and turned them onto range near the junction of the Vermejo and Canadian rivers. They built crude corrals from peeled logs, put up a house of notched timbers and earth roofs, and branded their stock with irons heated in a short, fierce fire under the open sky. Colfax County in those years rested uneasily on land titles and mining claims. The Maxwell land grant controlled millions of acres, and new owners from the east pushed to assert their rights over settlers and small ranchers who already lived on the ground. Gold mining at Elizabethtown, lumbering in the nearby hills, and trade through Cimarron brought drifters, merchants, and speculators who did not share the same loyalties as the families who tried to sink roots. The result was a climate where arguments concerning fences, timber, and ore veins could turn violent without much warning. Law existed in the form of sheriffs, judges, and territorial officers, yet their authority reached only as far as armed men allowed it. Clay fit easily into that environment. On the Vermejo range, he rode fence lines, counted calves, and watched for rustlers who might slip branded animals into their own herds at roundup. He rode into Cimarron with trail dust on his hat brim, and the settled look of a rancher who had stock on the grass and money in cattle. In town, he visited saloons and stores the same way he had approached camps along the Brazos trails, with his eyes moving constantly and his hand never far from his revolver. Cimarron sat at a crossroads for the Santa Fe Trail and for regional trade. Freight wagons rattled past the doors of Lambert's Saloon, the St. James Hotel, and other establishments where miners, teamsters, and cowboys gathered. Clay stood among them listening when talk turned to land disputes and strange disappearances on the road to Taos. Those disappearances centered on a large, rough man named Charles Kennedy. Kennedy operated a traveler's rest on the Taos Trail between Elizabethtown and Taos, near Palo Flechado Pass. His cabin offered a roof and a hot meal to men who had spent days in the saddle or on wagon seats. Travelers came in out of the weather, stabled their stock, ate at his table, and lay down under his roof, believing they would wake and continue their journeys. Kennedy's wife, a young woman from the region, watched her husband grow more brutal and unpredictable as the years passed. Stories later gathered from her and from neighbors described how passing guests did not reappear in Elizabethtown or Taos. Their horses and equipment changed hands, yet no one saw the men themselves again. The trail between Taos and Elizabethtown carried prospectors, cowboys, and small traders, people whose lives seldom left written records. That made it easy for a predator to operate with little fear that missing men would be traced. Kennedy's wife lived in that isolated cabin with their small son, and the knowledge that the floorboards and ground outside held secrets that no neighbor fully understood. The breaking point came when Kennedy turned his violence on his own child. She heard her husband confess to killing the boy to silence a telling remark concerning bodies under the floor. That act drove her to walk to Elizabethtown and report him not as an unfaithful husband or a cruel man, but as a killer who had turned their home into a slaughterhouse. When that news reached Elizabethtown, it fell on ground already dry with fear and anger. Mining camps had their share of violence, yet even hardened men drew a line at someone who killed not only travelers but his own son. Citizens and officials organized a party that rode out to Kennedy's cabin. There they found physical evidence that matched the wife's account. Human remains lay buried near the house and under its floor, mingled with ashes and disturbed soil. The odor of corruption hung in the air beneath the planks. Men who pried up boards and dug in the yard saw what Kennedy had tried to hide with fire and dirt. He was taken into custody and brought back to Elizabethtown under guard, charged with murder and confined in the local jail. Legal proceedings followed, yet they did not move with the speed or severity many citizens expected. In a region already divided by arguments over land grants and mining rights, trust in courts ran low. Residents of Elizabethtown heard that the judge assigned to Kennedy's case carried a reputation for corruption. Rumor spread that money or influence might spare a man who had murdered travelers and his own child. That prospect enraged people who believed there should be no margin for error in dealing with such a prisoner. In saloons and on street corners, talk shifted from what a court might do to what armed men could do directly. Clay listened to those conversations with a mind already hardened by years of war, Reconstruction conflict, and frontier disputes. The idea that a man like Kennedy could escape full punishment through a technicality or a bought decision offended his sense of personal justice. To him, the evidence in the ground at the cabin and the confession from the wife closed the question. He spoke with his brother John and with friends in Elizabethtown and Cimarron, men who had ridden trails, fought in the war, and lived by the rule that certain acts demanded immediate and permanent answers. Step by step, the talk moved from outrage to planning. On an October night in 1870, a group of armed men walked through the streets of Elizabethtown toward the small jail where Kennedy sat behind bars. Lantern light from saloons and boarding houses spilled across the rutted road, but most windows had gone dark. Dogs barked once or twice as the men passed, then fell silent when they heard the tone of the voices. Clay moved near the front of that group. He walked with the rolling stride of a man more accustomed to the saddle, revolver at his side, rope over his shoulder. The jail was not built for serious siege. It stood as a simple structure of wood and stone with a barred door and one or two narrow windows. The men did not ask permission to enter. Deputies who tried to block the doorway found themselves shoved hard against the wall or knocked senseless by the first rush. Inside, the narrow corridor echoed with bootsteps and shouted orders. Keys were taken, doors forced open, and Kennedy was dragged from his cell before he fully understood what had broken the night's routine. He faced a corridor lined with angry faces, many of them men he recognized from town. Some of them ranchers and miners he had served once at his table. They did not give him time to speak at length. A noose was thrown over his head, tightened against the skin of his neck, and the free end of the rope landed in Clay's hand. The mob hauled him into the street. The October air bit cold on skin damp with fear and sweat. Kennedy stumbled as they pushed him forward, hands bound or gripped by the men on either side. Someone fastened the rope to the saddle horn of a waiting horse. Clay swung into the saddle with the practiced ease of a man who had mounted under fire more than once. He did not give a speech. He dug his heels in. The horse lunged forward. Kennedy's body snapped backward, feet skidding through dust and gravel, then leaving the ground entirely as the rope went taut. His weight listed and bounced behind the animal as it moved down Elizabethtown's main street. Lanterns flared as doors opened. People woke to the sound of hooves, shouts, and the dragging body. Some stepped out and watched as the figure on the rope bumped along ruts and stones, clothing ripping, skin scraping away until patches of raw flesh shone through. Clay did not slow. He guided his horse along the length of the street and back again, while companions kept townsfolk from interfering. Each jolt stretched Kennedy's neck and battered his body. By the time they stopped, the man at the end of the rope no longer struggled. His face had darkened, tongue protruding, eyes bulging under the strain of strangulation and impact. Death did not end the group's work. Kennedy's cabin had given him years of opportunity to kill in secret. The men who had come for him believed that only a public answer would fit such hidden crimes. They took his corpse to a convenient place outside town, raised it off the ground, and finished the hanging by securing the rope high enough to let the body settle in full suspension. Midwives, merchants, miners, and ranch hands who came near the site the next morning saw the same thing. The bulk of the killer hanging slack, clothing torn, skin marked with deep abrasions and bruises, neck lengthened by the repeated jerks of the horse. Children were kept back, though some still caught glimpses from a distance that they would remember all their lives. Then they went further. A group of the lynchers cut the body down and laid it on a makeshift table. They removed the head with knives and whatever tools they had at hand, leaving a neck stump that gaped with exposed tissue and bone. Clay did not flinch during that work. When the head came free, it was fixed on a pole. Men lifted the grisly emblem and carried it the miles to Cimarron, riding through country where cattle grazed and ranch houses punctuated the plains. Dust clung to the dried blood and hair. By the time they reached town, the sight could not be ignored. They planted that pole near a fence at Lambert's saloon, a place where anyone walking to trade, drink, or gamble would see what happened to a man accused of murdering travelers and his own child. The presence of that head on display cut across the mixed opinions that neighbors held of Clay. Some saw him as an enforcer for ranch interests, a man who could not operate without violence. Others respected his readiness to act when courts faltered. After the Kennedy lynching, even those who had admired his nerve found themselves unsettled by the speed and ferocity of his justice. Miners and merchants in Cimarron talked in low voices concerning the sight of the severed head, its features distorted by fear and death, mounted at a height that forced every passerby to acknowledge it. Parents guided children along alternate paths around the saloon. Men who still backed Allison's decisions avoided looking directly at the pole for long. Kennedy's death closed a chapter of killing on the Taos Trail, but opened new questions concerning who held authority in Colfax County. Territorial officers saw that mob action as a sign that local ranchers and townspeople might ignore courts whenever they believed a case demanded swift retribution. That posed a direct challenge to the territorial government and the interest behind the Maxwell land grant. At the same time, small settlers and laborers muttered that if the law had dealt promptly with a confessed serial murderer, there would have been no space for such a lynching. They, in turn, took the episode as proof that formal structures served land companies and politicians more readily than they protected ordinary people. For Clay, the Kennedy lynching hardened his role as a man who answered blood with blood outside formal channels. He returned to his ranch work on the Vermejo with the same daily routines, yet wherever he went, men spoke his name with mention of that October night. In Elizabethtown, people pointed to the jail door that had splintered under the mob's force and remembered how he had come down the corridor with a rope in his hands. In Cimarron, customers at Lambert's saloon knew that the fence where they tied their horses had once held the head of a man Clay had helped kill. Every future confrontation involving him in Colfax County would carry the memory of that lynching. Lawmen, lawyers, and enemies understood that he would push a situation past threats into irreversible action once he decided that someone deserved to die. April 30th, 1871 opened cold on the plains around Fort Union. Government freighters moved in and out of the depot north of Cimarron, and in the corrals near the post, a line of 12 sturdy mules carried the brand of General Gordon Granger's command. Soldiers had watered and fed them before dawn, then left them tied while they turned to other chores. By mid-morning, dust rose from the road as a group of civilians rode in from the direction of Colfax County ranch country. Among them sat Clay Allison, hat brim low, eyes narrowed against the wind. He had come to the post with a reputation already marked by the Elizabethtown jailbreak and by hard riding on the Vermejo, and no one mistook him for a harmless visitor. Reports made later by officers at Fort Union recorded that 12 government mules left that corral in civilian hands. Army stock meant steady animals, sure-footed and tough, worth serious money on open range or trail. During the day, the gate stood open and the animals were gone. When the missing stock turned up again on distant pasture mixed with civilian herds, investigators wrote Clay Allison's name into their notes as one of the men responsible for driving the animals off the post. Word of that entry traveled down the wagon road and into the saloons of Cimarron, and his name became tied to mule theft just as securely as it was tied to earlier killings. That might have remained a single entry in a ledger if he had stayed away from the army corrals. Instead, in the autumn of 1871, he returned to Fort Union with several companions and turned a smoldering grievance into open chaos. The grass around the post had dried and a sharp wind blew down from the Sangre de Cristo peaks. Again, a group of mules stood bunched behind poles and rails, ears moving, gear stacked nearby for the next freight haul. Men on guard duty watched Allison's party ride in and move near the stock. Shouting erupted, riders swung hats, and a shot cracked the air. Startled animals lunged and the whole line broke. The mules crashed through the opening and thundered out across the open ground with Clay and his friends whipping and hollering to keep them moving. The uproar drew a detachment of mounted soldiers out through the post gate. Carbines came from scabbards as they spurred after the fleeing herd and the riders pushing it. On the uneven land outside Fort Union, the chase broke into scattered knots. One mule cut sideways, jerking a civilian rider off balance. A second plunged into an arroyo that forced its pursuers to swing wide. Clay, riding a horse he knew well, kept to higher ground and looked back over his shoulder as the soldiers closed the distance. In that instant between escape and capture, he twisted in the saddle, drew his revolver, and fired in the direction of the men behind him. The animal under him lunged as he squeezed the trigger, and the bullet tore into his own right foot. The pain exploded through flesh and bone. He dropped the pistol and clutched the horn while the world narrowed to the boot filling with blood. The horse slowed, confused by the sudden change in its rider. Red-soaked leather, sock, and trouser leg. The soldiers gained ground, but the breaking herd and the broken terrain confused the chase. Clay's companions grabbed his reins, shouted to him, and dragged him away from the line of fire. They abandoned some of the animals, cut across rough draws, and used gullies and low ridges to break contact with the troops. By the time the army detachment gathered up the stock it could recover and turned back toward the post, Allison lay in a crude hideout along the Red River, his foot torn and his temper burning. There the practical problems began. The wound was ragged and deep, and the damaged bone meant he could not simply bind it and climb back into the saddle. He needed a doctor, yet respectable practitioners in Cimarron did not volunteer to ride out to a wanted man's camp. Accounts from New Mexico sources describe how Allison sent a trusted friend, David Crockett, a nephew of the Tennessee frontiersman of the same name, to town with instructions that left no room for refusal. Crockett rode into Cimarron, found Dr. Robert Longwell, and told him that the gunfighter expected him on the Red River without delay. Longwell knew who had called and knew what it meant to turn down a summons backed by guns and a short temper. He went. The makeshift camp where Longwell found Clay smelled of blood, sweat, and old camp smoke. Inside a low shelter of canvas and brush, the patient lay with his boot cut away and the damaged foot swollen to twice its normal size. The skin around the wound stretched tight and discolored. Longwell cleaned the injury as best he could, cut away dead tissue, and tried to align the shattered bone with the limited tools he had carried in his bags. There was no proper operating room or steady light. Men held lanterns and poured whiskey both into the wound and down Allison's throat, while he gripped a saddle blanket and cursed in a steady, controlled rhythm that never quite broke into a shout. Longwell warned him concerning infection and the danger of losing the foot. Clay answered that he would leave the camp on that limb, no matter how crooked it became. He did leave, but the foot never worked as it once had. When the wound closed enough for him to put weight on it, the pain settled into a permanent place inside his body. Scar tissue tightened across the damaged joint and the bone never regained proper shape. Each step drove a reminder of the bullet's path up his leg. On some days he forced the limb to move in an almost even stride. On other days it dragged behind in a heavy swing that showed only pain and stubborn will. The fresh injury added one more physical burden to the older head trauma that Confederate doctors had described during the war. Together, those injuries shortened the distance between irritation and violence and made every slight feel sharper. Back in Cimarron, the story of the mule incident spread fast. Soldiers from Fort Union told merchants and saloon keepers that government animals had been taken, and that a civilian gunman had fired on troops, then crippled himself. Civilian gossip added names and places. Within weeks, everyone who drank at Lambert's saloon or shopped along the main road knew that Clay Allison had twice tampered with army stock and had ruined his own foot in the process. Some people laughed at the irony in private. Others kept their reactions quiet, knowing that the man at the center of the story still rode with armed friends and still remembered insults. The figure who returned to town months later looked different but carried himself with the same readiness to fight. He moved with a pronounced roll, the right shoulder dipping slightly with each step. A cane appeared in his hand, not polished as a gentleman's ornament but cut thick enough to break bone. In saloons, the tap of that cane on the plank floor announced his arrival before he spoke. Bartenders learned to fill his glass without delay. Men who had repeated jokes concerning the mule fiascos watched him from the corners of their eyes and weighed the risk of saying anything within reach of his hearing. Conversations died when he stepped through a doorway and started again only after he had moved on. According to accounts preserved in regional histories, the relationship between Allison and Dr. Longwell turned hostile almost as soon as the limp became permanent. Longwell had done what he could under poor conditions, yet the twisted foot stood in Clay's mind as a personal offense from the man who had held the knife. One afternoon he walked into the Colfax County clerk's office. where Longwell stood speaking with County Clerk John Lee and lawyer Melvin Mills. Without a word, Allison drew a long knife, flicked it across the room, and drove the blade through Lee's coat sleeve, pinning the man's arm to the wall. Lee struggled, more shocked than injured. Allison stepped forward, yanked the weapon free, then crossed the street and repeated the act with Mills in a neighboring building, driving steel through cloth and into timber until the young attorney froze in place with his arm trapped. The message traveled through Cimarron faster than any formal complaint. Both Lee and Mills worked with the faction that supported the Maxwell Land Grant Company and the men known locally as the Santa Fe Ring, the same network that many small ranchers and miners blamed for heavy taxes and slanted courts. By nailing those officials to their own walls, Allison made a public point concerning where he stood in that conflict. He did not need to kill them to make that point. The humiliation and the clear proof that his anger could turn physical in an instant silenced many open critics on that side, at least when he was in the room. As his foot mended enough for long rides, he returned to work on the Vermejo ranch. Cattle still needed tending, waterholes still needed watching, and cold winds still cut across the open ground. People who saw him ride fence lines during those months noticed a change. He carried the pain with him into every encounter. When a neighbor argued over a line of posts or a stretch of grazing, the talk stayed tense from first word to last. Ranch hands who worked under him or alongside him said that the rules on his place hardened. A man who left a gate open and let cattle drift into bad country received more than a simple rebuke. Allison dressed him down in front of the crew, then sent him alone to ride the roughest section of the range through darkness and weather until the lesson held. In Cimarron itself, his presence altered the mood of nearly every gathering. The town's main street lined up saloons, boarding houses, and stores facing a broad strip of packed earth cut with wagon ruts. Freight wagons rolled through, iron tires clanking on stones. Mexican families, Anglo ranchers, and mixed households shared the space with soldiers on leave from Fort Union and Ute and Jicarilla Apache who came into trade. Whenever Allison stepped from the hitch rail to the boardwalk, the air around him tightened. Crowds thinned slightly because no one wanted to bump him by accident. Gamblers watched him approach a table and decided whether to stay seated or move away. Women who worked the dance halls knew that his mood could turn without warning and adjusted their words based on how hard he limped that night and how empty his glass looked. He drank heavily through these years. Whiskey dulled the pain in his foot and disturbed his judgment at the same time. Even so, witnesses described how precise he remained when anger pushed him toward action. Accounts of knife work and pistol displays from this period show him emptying a revolver into a fence post without scattering shots wide. The injury had not slowed his hands. It had only made him more determined to prove that he remained the same man who had dragged Charles Kennedy from a cell and supervised a killing without waiting for a court. That need to demonstrate strength appeared in nearly every public moment. Law officers understood the danger he presented. Colfax County sheriffs and deputies carried warrants, tried to serve papers, and attempted to hold some image of control in a place already shaken by the Colfax County War. Yet every move against Allison carried the risk of gunfire on a crowded street. After the mule stampedes, Army reports noted him as a dangerous civilian, but the same reports also admitted that clear evidence tying him to specific crimes beyond the stock incidents was thin. That gap between reputation and formal proof meant that he often walked free where other men might have faced long confinement. As the calendar turned toward 1873, the broader conflict around the Maxwell Land Grant deepened. Settlers complained that grant agents pressed them off land they had improved for years. Miners argued over claims on gold-bearing ground near Elizabethtown. Preachers such as Methodist circuit rider Franklin Tolby spoke in pulpits and in open-air meetings against corruption and violence. In that climate, Allison's role as an enforcer for the opposition side drew attention. He spoke with Tolby and Cimarron, attended meetings of discontented ranchers, and made it plain that his guns and his nerve were available when they believed the ring had pushed too far. Violence remained close beneath the surface, more present in cautious looks and long silences than in open street fights. A man who owed money to a grant agent found himself warned in a back room that pushing a collection might lead to trouble. A small rancher who had received a notice to vacate his place woke to see armed riders on a hill above his home, sitting their horses and watching until the meaning of their presence was clear. When townspeople asked who had sent those men, the answers stayed indirect, but Clay's name sat close to the center of the rumors. In early 1874, tension around the Allison camp led toward one of the most widely reported encounters in his life, the meeting with Philip "Chunk" Colbert. That collision grew from roots planted years earlier on the Brazos when Allison beat ferryman Zachary Colbert after a dispute over charges at a river crossing. Zachary's nephew did not forget the humiliation. Over the next few years, he built his own record as a gunman, killing men in Texas and New Mexico and telling associates that he intended to even the score with the Tennessean, who had once left his uncle sprawled on a riverbank. By the time he rode into Colfax County looking for Clay, people around Cimarron understood that the crippled rancher with the cane and the man called Chunk Colbert were moving toward each other, and that the result would again show how Allison responded when a challenge stood in front of him instead of hiding behind paper or rumor. Dawn on January 7, 1874, broke cold along the Canadian River where the Clifton House stood near the Santa Fe Trail. Frost silvered the coarse grass around the adobe inn, and thin smoke rose from the kitchen chimney while teamsters watered their stock at the river edge. The big two-story building with its gallery and outbuildings had already seen years of freight wagons, stagecoaches, and drifters pass through its yard. That morning it waited for another day of traffic, the clatter of harness and the shuffle of boots on its veranda, without any sign that before nightfall one of the region's most feared gunmen would die at a dining table inside its reach. For weeks beforehand, talk along the trail and in Colfax County saloons had carried the same name. Chunk Colbert, a heavy-set gunman from Texas, had drifted into the territory and begun moving between Cimarron, Trinidad, and the settlements near Rayton Pass. He carried a reputation for killing. Men along the Brazos and in New Mexico said he had shot several opponents in barroom quarrels and street fights, and that he had once walked away from a body in Cimarron after deciding a man had paid too much attention to his wife. Wherever he went, he treated arguments as contests to be finished with a handgun. Stories told on porches and in stables counted up his victims and repeated them as proof that he was as dangerous as any man riding the frontier. Colbert also carried a personal grievance aimed at one specific target. Years earlier, a ferryman from his family had suffered a public beating at a river crossing on the Brazos after trying to charge the Allisons a price that Clay refused to pay. The memory of that fight, and of the humiliation it brought to the Colbert name, followed the gunman west. In saloons he said plainly that he intended to meet the Tennessean who had thrashed his kin and to add that man to the list of bodies behind him. The talk was not idle. People in Cimarron heard him speak it, and riders carried the words north and south until Clay knew that a man with a score to settle was hunting him. The Clifton House, sitting a few miles south of present-day Rayton, offered beds, food, and a relay station for the Barlow and Sanderson stage line. Its long verandas and high-ceilinged rooms gave travelers a brief taste of comfort between stretches of wind and dust. Inside, a large parlor, a dining room, and sleeping chambers opened off a central hall, while a separate, smaller house nearby provided more cramped quarters. Spanish-speaking cooks and laborers worked in the kitchens and stables. The place had seen trouble even before this winter morning. Not long before, a sheriff from Trinidad had ridden in looking for Colbert and had mistaken a sleeping waiter for his quarry, shooting the unarmed man in his bed. That killing left the staff wary of both lawmen and gunfighters, and it underlined how far violence could reach into a business that tried to serve all sides. Null, this January day, Colbert lingered near the inn with his horse in the corral and his eyes on the road. He had learned that Clay Allison was in the region and meant to draw him into a situation where he could set the terms. Reports from later accounts agree that Colbert sent word or otherwise let it be known that he wished to see Allison and to settle things between them. The message reached the Vermejo country and brought Clay riding toward the trail. He came with the same rolling stride when on foot and the same straight-backed seat in the saddle that Cimarron had learned to recognize. Pain in his damaged foot followed every step, but he did not change his pace when he crossed the yard at Clifton or when he swung down by the corral. Before they ever sat down at a table, the two men tested each other in the way most natural to riders who believed in speed and nerve. A stretch of open ground near the inn served as an impromptu racecourse. The horses were brought out, saddles cinched, and a short course marked. Stage drivers, hostlers, and travelers stepped away from their chores long enough to watch. Clay mounted his horse with practiced ease, adjusting his weight so that his injured foot sat where it would not slip. Colbert climbed aboard his animal with the confidence of a man who had lived his life on horseback. At the signal, they drove their mounts forward, dirt clods flying from hooves as the animals pushed into a quarter-mile sprint. The race pounded down the flat and back under a thin winter sun. Riders bent low over necks, slapping reins, teeth clenched against the cold air that knifed into their lungs. The two horses ran close, neck and neck, so near that splashes of mud from one flung against the other's flanks. On the edges of the course, men yelled encouragement, some for Allison, some for Colbert, but most simply for the thrill of speed. When they pulled up, breathing hard and with foam on the horses' sides, any clear win lay in dispute. The lack of a decisive finish did nothing to cool the underlying purpose. Both men knew the race had been nothing more than a prelude. Afterward, instead of reaching directly for weapons, Colbert suggested that they share a meal. At some point during those hours, the two arranged to eat together, not in the busy main dining room of the Clifton house, but in one of the smaller buildings nearby. A local Spanish woman prepared the food, cooking meat and bread while the two gunmen waited in a room sparsely furnished with a table and chairs. On another day, two men sitting down to supper after hard riding might have passed for common trail companions. Here the familiarity was thin. Each had reason to believe the other intended to kill him. When they took seats, Clay chose his place carefully. Accounts place him with his back near a wall and a clear view of the door. His revolver sat close at hand, either on his lap under the table or within easy reach under his coat. Colbert sat across from him, broad-shouldered, the brim of his hat casting a shadow across eyes that had watched other men die. The table between them held plates, knives, a pot of coffee, and the meat and bread set down by the cook. The smell of cooked beef and strong coffee filled the cramped space, mixing with the scent of dust and sweat clinging to their clothes. They talked while they ate, yet every word rode on top of tension that no one in the room could miss. Conversation touched on horses, people they both knew on the Brazos and in New Mexico, and the state of trails and ranches in Colfax County. Clay answered in his usual clipped manner, giving enough to keep the talk moving without easing his guard. Colbert watched his hands and face, searching for signs of weakness. The Spanish woman kept to the kitchen area, listening to tones more than words, aware that a wrong move or an ill-timed interruption could put her in the line of fire. Clay ate steadily, cutting meat, chewing, and washing each bite down with coffee. He had come into the room knowing that the man across from him had walked through towns boasting that he would be the one to bring him down. That knowledge shaped every choice he made at the table, from where he sat to how he rested his right hand. For his part, Colbert seemed unwilling to let go of the public mask of friendliness. More than once he laughed, a short, rough sound, and made comments that would have passed for ordinary trail banter if not for the way his eyes never stayed still. Sometime during the meal, the talk thinned. Knives scraped on plates. The cook had stepped out of direct view. Outside, wind worked at the walls and rattled whatever loose boards the building carried. In that lull, Colbert made his move. With his right hand, he reached for the revolver he had kept near his side. The motion came fast, driven by years of practice drawing steel on other men. He rose from his chair as he pulled, bringing the barrel up with the clear intent to fire across the table at the man he had invited to eat. The room, however, crowded that movement. The heavy wooden table stood between them, set with plates and dishes. As Colbert jerked the pistol upward, the barrel struck the edge of the table. The impact knocked his hand offline and checked the motion for a fraction of a second. That pause, brief as it was, opened enough space for Allison to act. His own revolver cleared his coat with a smooth, practiced pull. He did not shout a warning or offer any last chance to stand down. He leveled the weapon and fired once into Colbert's head. The shot slammed through bone and brain at close range. The report filled the room, deafening in the enclosed space, and the pistol's muzzle flash lit the walls for an instant. Colbert's head snapped backward. A spray of blood and bone fragments splashed across the table, into the food, and onto the far wall. The gun in his hand jerked, discharged into the ceiling or the air as grip and intention vanished from his arm, then dropped from his fingers. His body sagged, chair tipping, and he went down hard onto the floor beside the table. Plates rattled, one slid off the edge and shattered. The smell of gun smoke mingled with the odor of fresh blood and overturned coffee. For a moment, there was only the ringing in ears and the sound of heavy breathing. Clay remained seated, pistol still in his hand, eyes fixed on the fallen man. He watched for any sign of movement that might require another shot. Seeing none, he stood, his injured foot making his rise slower but not hesitant, and stepped around the table. Colbert lay on his back or twisted partly onto his side, eyes already glazing, mouth slack. The wound in his head leaked a dark stream that spread across the rough floorboards. The cook in the next room cried out, then fell silent, afraid that any movement might draw fire. Once he was certain the threat had ended, Allison slipped the revolver back into its place. People outside, jolted by the report, ran toward the small house. Voices shouted questions, boots pounded on the packed earth. When they reached the doorway, they saw the gunman from Texas bleeding on the floor and the man from the Vermejo standing over him with his weapon holstered and his face already settling back into a hard, watchful expression. He did not run. He did not pretend ignorance. He told those gathered that Colbert had tried to draw on him at the table and that he had answered the draw. In later retellings, witnesses and storytellers preserved a remark they said he made when someone asked why he had chosen to eat with a man who had promised to kill him. Clay answered that he had not wanted to send a man to hell on an empty stomach. The line fit the harsh humor of the frontier and spread quickly through Colfax County, carried by teamsters, stage drivers, and ranch hands who stopped at the Clifton House or Lambert's saloon. It painted him as a man so certain of his own skill and so comfortable with killing that he could sit through a full meal opposite a sworn enemy, confident he would win when the pistols came out. Law required some formal answer to a killing, even on a trail where violent deaths no longer surprised anyone. A coroner's inquest or similar local hearing weighed the facts of the case. Men who had heard Colbert's threats and seen his attempts to provoke Allison in earlier encounters spoke under oath. They testified that the dead man had carried a history of shootings and grudges, and that he had made his aim clear long before the two shared a table. The man who ran the inn and members of the staff confirmed that they had heard talk of Colbert's intent and that the sound of shots had come from the smaller house where only the two gunmen and the cook had been present. No evidence emerged that Allison had lured Colbert into a trap or fired without provocation. The visible position of Colbert's gun and the testimony concerning his move to draw it supported the claim that the shot came in response to an immediate threat. In the language of the time, the killing was judged a clear case of self-defense. Clay walked away without a conviction. The legal process ended with a report, a burial, and a community that now had one less unpredictable gunman in its midst and one more piece of proof that the man from Tennessee did not hesitate when lives came up against his own. Colbert's body received no fine monument. Accounts place his grave behind the Clifton House, in unmarked ground beyond the regular traffic of guests and freighters. He had come into the territory boasting of his tally of dead and of his plans for one more. He left it as another name on Allison's list of opponents who had not survived. For a time, the fresh mound drew the eyes of travelers who knew the story, a rough reminder that a short temper and a long record of killing could meet a sudden stop in a cramped room without warning. The effect on Clay's reputation took shape immediately. Before this day, the Kennedy lynching, the mule incidents, and the constant intimidation in Cimarron had already given him a dark name. After the Clifton House shooting, that name carried new weight wherever lawmen and outlaws talked shop. Law officers studying wanted posters and thinking through how to enforce orders in Colfax County had to reckon with the fact that one of the region's proven gunfighters now had another killing behind him, with witnesses and a legal stamp calling it justified. Men on the other side of the law, considering ambush or assassination as a way to remove him, heard how quickly Colbert had died once he made his move and measured their own chances against that speed. In the months that followed, the story traveled far beyond the Canadian River. Teamsters carried it along the Santa Fe Trail to Las Vegas and Santa Fe. Cowboys repeated it in Dodge City, exaggerating small details but keeping the core facts the same. Clay Allison had sat down at a table with a man who meant to shoot him and had killed him with one bullet when the draw came. That pattern, half hospitality and half deadly calculation, hardened the sense that this rancher's mind did not work on the same tracks as the ordinary men who passed through the Clifton yard. It was one more sign that he would meet threat with unblinking violence even in the most ordinary setting. The Clifton House itself returned to its normal business soon enough. Stages rolled in. Passengers stepped down stiff from hours on wooden seats, and cooks carried platters and coffee into the big dining room. Yet the staff could not forget the day when blood had spread across a small table and a reputation had grown even larger. Years later, when the house stood empty and only its foundations and stories remained, people still pointed out where the smaller building had once stood and repeated the tale of the meal that ended with a gunshot across the dishes. For lawmen, the event set a clear boundary concerning how far they were willing to push Allison without overwhelming force. For outlaws and would-be challengers, it stood as a warning that walking into a room with him could end in death before the chair scraped fully back from the table. September 14th. 1875. The Methodist circuit rider Franklin James Tolby rode into Cimarron Canyon on his way back from Elizabethtown toward Cimarron, following the narrow trace that wound between timbered slopes and the creek. He had preached, carried mail, and argued over land and justice in Colfax County until his voice had become the main sound for small ranchers, miners, and homesteaders who felt pressed by the Maxwell Land Grant Company and the Santa Fe ringmen behind it. That morning he rode alone, a thin man in dark clothes on a small horse carrying letters and notes from people who trusted him more than any official out of Santa Fe. He did not step out of that canyon alive. Tolby's work had made him enemies. In sermons and private meetings, he had condemned the forced removals of settlers from Grant land, the heavy hand of company agents, and the intimidation used on people who tried to file claims of their own. He stood beside families who had built houses and dug irrigation ditches only to see papers from distant offices declare them trespassers. He visited the Ute and Jicarilla and spoke of promises that had been broken when the grant passed into new hands. In Cimarron he spoke plainly from the pulpit and on the street. His words carried across language lines and drew support from Anglo settlers and from Hispanic families who feared losing their fields. Men tied to the grant and the ring heard those same words as a threat to their property and influence. Late in the day, his horse came into Cimarron without him. The animal moved along the road with empty saddle and tack still in place. People who knew Tolby's habits understood immediately that something had gone wrong. A search party formed, made up of ranch hands, miners, and townsmen who rode up the canyon where he had last been seen. In the fading light, they followed tracks along the creek until one of them called out from a bend in the trail. The preacher lay face down on the ground, clothing stained dark, the back of his coat torn by a bullet. When they turned him, they saw the entry wound, the stillness of his limbs, and the dirt pressed into his hands where he had fallen. No money had been taken. His saddlebag still hung from the saddle. Whoever fired had come for him, not for loot. They carried the body back into Cimarron. Word spread through the town and out along the trails. People gathered at the church, at Lambert's saloon, and along the main road in tight knots of talk. A Methodist preacher who had spoken for them lay dead, shot from behind in a canyon where he had traveled for years. Newspapers in Las Vegas and Santa Fe described the killing as an assassination, and printed early reports that he had been ambushed because of his role in the land dispute. A reward in the thousands of dollars went up for information on the murderer. Despite that sum, no man walked into a sheriff's office to claim it. Suspicion fell quickly on the side that had gained most from silencing him. Locals pointed to men tied to the Maxwell Land Grant Company and to the Santa Fe Ring, naming mail contractor Florencio Donahue, probate judge Dr. Robert Longwill, attorney Melvin Mills, and the newly appointed Cimarron constable Cruz Vega. Vega carried mail on some runs and had been seen in the canyon on the day of the shooting. His appointment as constable had already angered settlers who viewed him as an ally of the grant in the ring. Now talk in both English and Spanish called his name in connection with Tolby's death. Tolby's death struck Clay Allison like a personal insult. He had known the preacher in Cimarron, heard him speak against the grant, and listened to him argue that common people needed someone to stand up to Santa Fe influence. Clay lived by his own violent code, yet he still carried the strict religious upbringing from Tennessee that taught him to respect a minister who stood with his people. When he heard that Tolby had been shot from behind in the canyon, he saw it as a coward's act done on behalf of powerful men who hid behind paper and office. That feeling aligned him fully with the settler side in the Colfax County War. The man who stepped into Tolby's place as public accuser was Reverend Oscar Patrick McMains, another Methodist preacher. McMains walked the streets of Cimarron collecting statements, rode the canyon to see the ground where the body had fallen, and followed every scrap of talk that pointed toward a name. He spoke with Donahue, with Vega, and with anyone else who had been near the canyon that day. Each conversation deepened his conviction that formal law would not move fast enough or deep enough to touch the men tied to the ring. When his patience with courts broke, he turned to the one man in the county who had already shown that he could and would act outside them. He went to Clay Allison. Clay listened while McMains laid out what he knew and what he suspected. A preacher who had spoken for the poor had been gunned down. A constable linked to the grant had been seen in the right place on the right day. A network of men in Santa Fe had reason to want the voice silenced and the settlers cowed. Each point matched Clay's own sense of grievance. He had seen the ring's reach when judges and officials bent toward the land company. He had seen ordinary ranchers pushed aside. Tolby's death, in his mind, crossed a line. By the time McMains finished, Allison had agreed to help find and confront the man they believed had carried the gun. On the evening of October 30th, 1875, tension in Cimarron hardened into action. McMains and Allison moved through town speaking quietly to men they trusted. Ranchers, miners, and a few small merchants gathered horses and weapons, pulling kerchiefs up over their faces or dragging hoods over their heads. The group rode north out of Cimarron, following the road toward Poniel Creek and the Moreno Valley, where Vega had been seen working in the fields near William Lowe's place. The only light came from stars and from distant ranch lamps. Hooves struck the packed earth in a steady, controlled rhythm as the party closed on its target. They found Vega near the roadside, close to the telegraph line that carried wires along the trail. Accounts place him in or near a cornfield, either at work or on his way between chores. When the riders surrounded him, he recognized some of their horses and voices and understood why they had come. Armed men pulled him from his mount and dragged him to the base of a telegraph pole. A rope came out of someone's saddlebag, looped over a crossarm, and dropped down to circle his neck. With each movement of their hands, the mob tightened control over his body as well as his fate. The first questions came with the rope still slack. Who killed Reverend Tolby? Who paid for it? Who rode in the canyon that day? Vega denied every accusation and swore he had not fired a shot. The men around him did not accept that answer. They hauled on the rope and lifted him from his feet until his weight hung against the noose. His boots kicked at the pole. His hands clawed at the hemp around his throat. After several long moments, they eased him down, letting him gasp for air, then pressed him for names again. When he continued to protest his innocence, they lifted him once more. The pattern repeated. Up into strangling darkness, down to draw ragged breaths and feel the night air on skin, then up again when his answers did not fit what they wanted to hear. The rope cut into his neck, raising deep grooves. Blood vessels in his face strained and broke. At some point during that torture, he changed his words and named another man. Manuel Cardenas of Elizabethtown, he said, had fired the fatal shot in the canyon. He said Cardenas had been hired by men in league with the ring, including Donahue, Longwill, and Mills. He tried to push responsibility upward, away from himself. McMains heard that confession and believed he had wrung the truth from the victim. Sickened by what the men around him had already done, he stepped back. Some accounts put him riding away toward Lowe's ranch, convinced that the mob had gone far enough and that Vega would live to stand in a courtroom now that a name had been secured. That judgment misread the mood of the group and the strength of Allison's anger. The preacher's withdrawal left the field to men who wanted more than words. What followed turned a brutal interrogation into a killing. Vega's captors beat him with fists, boots, and gun barrels. They hauled on the rope again, snapping his body upward until his neck and shoulders groaned under the strain. Shots rang out in the dark, echoes rolling off low hills. Later reports described gunfire after the preacher left, followed by silence. When dawn reached the telegraph line near Poniel Creek, Vega lay dead at the base of the pole. A clump of hair torn from his head lay on the ground nearby. Rope burns girdled his neck. His face showed the color and swelling of strangulation and blows. Some accounts added bullet wounds to the ruin. It was plain to anyone who saw the body that he had not died quickly or gently. Clay's role in those hours stood at the center of local talk. Settlers who hated the grant said with satisfaction that he had helped bring Tolby's killer to judgment when courts would not. Histories and testimonies recorded later described him at the head of the masked riders, a man whose presence lent force and direction to the mob. Other accounts placed McMains as the one who first confronted Vega, with Allison standing close as the enforcer who made sure the questions bit deep. None of those narratives washing through Cimarron that week cleaned the blood or rope marks from Vega's body. Even in death, the constable found no mercy from Allison. When friends and relatives sought to bury Vega in the Cimarron cemetery, Clay objected. He said plainly that the man who had helped send a Methodist preacher to the ground in the canyon would not be laid to rest in the same ground. He used his standing among the armed settlers to block a grave inside town limits. The body went instead to a lonely plot outside Cimarron, a slight stretch of dirt for a man whose death now pulled the county's Hispanic community into open fury. Vega's relatives and neighbors saw more than the body of a suspected killer. They saw a Mexican constable taken outside the law, tortured under a telegraph pole, and dumped in rough ground while the men responsible walked free and even bragged about their work. At the funeral, voices rose in grief and anger. Among those present stood Juan Francisco Pancho Griego, a Civil War veteran and Vega's kinsman tied by family and friendship. He watched the battered corpse lowered and listened to stories of what had been done to it. Somewhere during that service, he gave words to a resolution that had been building since dawn. He told people that he would take revenge on the men who had hanged and beaten Vega. The name most often linked with that vow was Clay Allison. 2 days later, on November 1st, 1875, Cimarron's main street carried the usual traffic of wagons, ranch riders, and townsfolk. Inside Lambert's saloon at the St. James Hotel, Clay stood at the bar or sat at a gaming table, the details differing in later tellings, but all agreeing that he was on the premises, armed and unconcerned. The room held its familiar mix of smoke, spilled liquor, and talk. Bullet scars already pocked the ceiling and walls from earlier fights. The sound of piano keys or rough laughter from a back room rose and fell with the movement of men at the tables. Outside, Griego rode into town with armed companions, including members of Vega's family and allies from the pro-Grant side. They tied their horses at the hitch rail and strode toward the St. James with hands close to their belts. People on the porch recognized faces and stepped aside. When the doors swung open, the saloon's noise dropped. The group pushed in and spread along the room until they faced the man they blamed for Vega's death. Words carried in Spanish and English across the space between them. Griego named the lynching, named the telegraph pole, and named Vega's broken body. He told Allison that he had killed a constable and that there would be payment. Clay did not back away or try to leave. He had heard the threats since the lynching and had expected confrontation. He kept his shoulders squared and his right hand free, eyes fixed on the men across from him. Witnesses later recalled that he answered the accusations without apology. He said Vega had participated in the murder of a preacher and that the rope had finished a job the courts refused to start. The words did not ease anything in the room. Men along the walls edged away, suddenly interested in doorways and side rooms, unwilling to stand between opposing guns. Griego moved closer. Some accounts said he offered his hand in a show of false friendship, hoping to distract Clay long enough to draw a weapon. Others described him cursing and reaching straight for the revolver at his side. All agree that his hand dropped toward the butt of his gun. Allison watched that movement and acted in the split space before a barrel could clear leather. His own revolver came up smooth from his holster. The saloon's light flashed on steel as he fired more than once across the short distance. The rounds hit Griego in the upper body and head. He jerked backward, hat knocked aside, and crashed to the floor among broken glass and overturned chairs. Blood spread quickly from under him, darkening the floorboards, running into cracks and soaking the legs of nearby tables. His gun either never left the holster or came only halfway free before his fingers slackened. The air inside the saloon filled with the flat reek of gun smoke layered over whiskey and sweat. Men who had ducked at the sound of the shot straightened and saw the result, one body face up or twisted eyes already dull. Allison still standing with his revolver in hand. Panic rippled through the crowd, but the moment passed without further gunfire. Griego's companions had walked into the saloon expecting a chance to avenge Vega. They now faced a man whose draw they had just seen and whose reputation stood behind him. Some reached toward their own weapons and then stopped when they realized that any move would set off another close-range killing. In the end, they gathered around the fallen kinsman and let Allison leave the saloon without a fresh fight. The St. James staff closed the room and barred the doors long enough to move the body and scrub the worst of the blood, although stains carried the memory for those who looked closely. Territorial law could not ignore a killing in such a public place, even in Cimarron. On November 10, 1875, authorities charged Clay Allison with the murder of Francisco Griego. A hearing followed, drawing in witnesses from both sides of the land war. Men who had heard Griego's threats before the confrontation told their stories under oath. They described how he had vowed to kill Allison over Vega's death, how he had come into town armed, and how his hand had moved toward his revolver first. Others from the saloon described the positions of the bodies and the location of Griego's gun when the shooting stopped. The weight of that testimony fell on the side of self-defense. The judge or examining magistrate ruled that Allison had responded to an immediate mortal threat inside a crowded room. No jury heard a case, no prison term followed. The charge was dropped. Clay walked out of the proceeding a free man with the killing of another armed opponent added to his tally, and the law once more written down as having found his actions justified. Outside the courtroom, the damage ran deeper than any legal conclusion. In less than 2 months, the county had seen a preacher shot from behind in a canyon, a constable lynched and beaten under a telegraph pole, and a Hispanic gunman related to the constable killed on the floor of the most prominent saloon in town. Each death pulled new groups into the conflict. Settlers enraged by Tolby's murder pointed to the Vega lynching and the Griego shooting as proof that they were willing to answer hired killers with their own brand of justice. Hispanic families and Grant supporters pointed to the same events as proof that armed Anglo ranchers with Allison at their head could destroy their men with impunity. From that autumn forward, Colfax County did not drift back to uneasy peace. Cavalry detachments would soon ride in to stand between factions. More investigations and killings would follow, including the arrest and death of Manuel Cardenas and fresh threats against the lawyers and doctors tied to the ring. At the center of the storm stood Clay Allison, now marked not only as the man who had dragged Charles Kennedy from a cell and shot Chunk Colbert at a supper table, but also as the vigilante who had ridden under a telegraph line with a rope in hand and faced down an entire angry family inside Lambert's saloon. Lawmen and outlaws alike learned that autumn that confronting him in public could end in strangled bodies, crushed faces, and a corpse bleeding on saloon planks while the law called it self-defense. The night of January 19, 1876 settled hard over Cimarron, New Mexico, with snow crusting in the ruts of the main street and light leaking from saloon doors onto packed, filthy snow. Inside Lambert's St. James Hotel, the barroom stayed hot, thick with pipe smoke and the smell of spilled whiskey, while a handful of men argued over the latest issue of the Cimarron News and Press. The editor, William Dawson, had printed another piece that praised allies in Santa Fe and mocked the vigilantes who had hanged Cruz Vega and hunted down Manuel Cardenas. Clay Allison's name lay on the page in stiff black letters, tied to murder and lawlessness, treated as a curse on Colfax County and a tool of men the town hated. On the street outside, boot heels broke the icy crust near the newspaper office on Tenorio Plaza. The News and Press building stood small and plain, its front windows dark, its doors locked against the cold. Inside, the Ramage printing press waited heavy on its bed, ink rollers streaked in type cases full of letters that shaped every quarrel in town. The men who worked there had gone home, leaving only the smell of old ink and the faint chill that crept through warped boards when the wind turned. The press had survived wars, owners, and hard freighting, and now sat near the center of a county that used newsprint as a weapon. Clay Allison walked toward that dark doorway with several riders at his back, their outlines shifting in the dim light from Tavern Alley. He wore a heavy coat thrown open despite the cold, revolver low on his hip, hat pulled down over eyes already glossed by alcohol. At his shoulder moved a younger man people in Cimarron called a nephew of Davy Crockett, thin-faced and restless, fingers drumming on the stock of a carbine. They came from the St. James with anger already lit. Allison carried the newspaper in his left hand, the ink still fresh where Dawson's editorial called vigilantes midnight assassins and hinted that certain cattlemen hid behind masks to do the work of cowards. They did not knock. A shoulder hit the door and it splintered inward under the combined weight of several men. Wood cracked, hinges shrieked, and cold air pushed ahead of them into the press room. In the dim oil lamp light someone found and lit. Stacked papers, type trays, and the iron frame of the press cast thick shadows on the plank floor. Allison stepped across the threshold, breathing hard. He slapped the folded newspaper against the press bed, the pages smearing a faint mirror of Dawson's words across iron that had already printed the issue. Voices rose and bounced off bare walls. Allison cursed the editor, the Santa Fe ring, and men who used news columns instead of pistols. A sledgehammer changed hands. One slow swing tested the weight, then a heavy blow fell across the press frame. Iron rang with a sharp report that cut through the night, then rang again as another blow fell, then another, each hit jarring the machine that had carried years of stories into the territory. Type cases crashed to the floor, spilling letters across the boards like hard black gravel. Someone kicked them into piles, boot soles grinding lead and antimony into soft dust. Allison put a boot against the side of the press and helped rock it loose from its bolts. Men grunted with the strain, shoulders bunching under wool coats as they tipped several 100 pounds of metal toward the door. The legs scraped grooves into the floor. Once they had it moving, momentum did the work. The press bumped down the steps, crashed into the street, and skidded against the frozen mud. Pistols barked in the air while the men shouted over the noise, the reports echoing between the hotel and the plaza wall. Dogs began to bark in scattered yards farther away. They dragged the press through the snow toward the Cimarron River, leaving twin furrows behind its heavy base. The night stayed clear and bitter, stars fixed over black hills. Some men slipped on the packed ruts and swore, catching themselves on the iron. Others laughed as if hauling a cannon to war. At the riverbank, the ice had formed in jagged shelves. The men braced their feet, rocked the machine once more, and heaved it over the edge. The press dropped, hit the ice, broke through, and vanished with a low crashing sound, leaving only shards of broken crust floating on the dark current. Back at the office, smashed type cases and broken furniture covered the floor. An unfinished stack of newspapers lay overturned, half the sheets blank on one side, the other half carrying Dawson's last words from that press. Allison picked one up, scrawled his name in large handwriting across the untouched side, and tossed it back onto the pile. The air inside the building tasted of ink dust and gunpowder. When the men left, they kicked the ruined door closed behind them, leaving the office open to the cold and to the eyes of anyone who came at first light. By dawn, smoke from kitchen fires lifted straight into a windless sky. Citizens of Cimarron gathered around the wrecked doorway, staring in at the damage. The ramage press that had printed territorial laws and church circulars many years earlier no longer stood in its corner. Lead type lay scattered in drifts along the floorboards, each letter now just scrap. William Morley and Frank Springer saw their investment destroyed. Their paper would not carry any side of the Colfax County War until another press could be hauled over rough roads from a distant railhead. Ada Morley arrived wrapped in a winter shawl, her pregnancy heavy enough that each step from her house across the plaza cost effort. She looked past the crowd and stepped into the office, skirts brushing splintered wood. Dawson's editorials had enraged her in recent months, yet seeing the ruin stirred anger of a different kind. A free press had been ripped apart overnight by men who preferred threats to argument. Outside, horses shifted. Clay Allison stood near the hitch rail with his hat low and his jaw set, the night's whiskey leaving a hard edge rather than a hangover. Ada walked straight to him. Her voice met him sharp and controlled, naming the press the cost of hauling it into the territory, the risk her husband had taken to print against powerful men in Santa Fe. She called the destruction cowardly. Men in the street stepped back to give them space. Allison watched her with an expression that shifted from stubborn defiance to something closer to shame under the weight of her words. His hands stayed loose at his sides, fingers away from his pistol. When she finished, Allison reached inside his coat, pulled out a roll of currency and placed it in her palm. The money represented trail wages for cowboys, cattle profits, and gambling wins from smoky tables along the Santa Fe Trail. He told her to buy another press. He added that his quarrel ran with Dawson and with politicians, not with a woman standing in the ruins of her family's livelihood. Ada closed her fingers around the money without thanking him, turned away, and went back inside the gutted office to see what else could be salvaged. The destruction of the Cimarron News and Press traveled across the territory within days. From Fort Union came word that Governor Samuel Axtell wanted troops kept in Cimarron to support Sheriff Reinhardt and to assist in restoring order. Reports to Army headquarters described a newspaper office broken open by outlaws, its press thrown into the river, citizens frightened, and civil authorities unable to manage a community already famous for lynchings and gunfights. The governor requested military help and used Clay Allison's name as a clear example of the type of violent man he intended to curb. When permission arrived from Washington, mounted soldiers from the 9th Cavalry rode back into Cimarron. Carbines stacked in the street and tents pitched not far from the plaza. The sound of bugles joined church bells and saloon pianos. Blue uniforms and polished brass moved past adobe houses and rough pine storefronts where cowboys and freighters watched from doorways. Troopers patrolled the roads leading into town, their presence both reassurance and threat. Settlers who had cheered when Allison rode against men linked to the Santa Fe ring now watched federal power arrive under the pretense of protecting them from their own champion. Territorial lawmakers in Santa Fe decided that Colfax County could not control its own courts. Legislation attached the county to Taos for judicial purposes, forcing any serious case to be tried far from Cimarron. Judge Henry Waldo issued warrants for men suspected in the deaths of Cruz Vega and Manuel Cardenas. The list included Reverend Oscar McMains and Clay Allison. District Attorney Benjamin Stevens received orders to carry those warrants into Cimarron with the backing of soldiers from Fort Union. The same violence that residents had used to strike at their enemies now justified outside control and legal pressure from men they distrusted. Stevens arrived to find a town bristling. Supporters of McMains and Allison watched every move by the soldiers and the district attorney, ready to warn their friends if arrest parties stepped toward certain doors. Cimarron's narrow streets and alleys filled with quiet observers, men who leaned against walls with folded arms and eyes that missed little. Allison moved carefully during those weeks, spending more time on his ranch and less at the St. James bar. When he came to town, he still drank, but he no longer stayed until dawn. The combination of soldiers, warrants, and new indictments against vigilantes closed in around him like slowly tightening wire. By December of that year, cattle work drew him north along the old trail again. Clay and his brother John helped drive a herd toward Colorado, pushing beeves along winter grass and frozen creek crossings until they reached the Arkansas Valley. Las Animas stood near the river, a small but lively trail town with frame buildings, false fronts, and a scattering of adobe houses stretching away toward open prairie. Cold wind blew down the main street carrying the smell of smoke from coal stoves and the thin notes of a fiddle from the Olympic dance hall. On the night of December 21st, 1876, the Olympic swayed under bright lamplight and the stomp of boots on its plank floor. Local couples and trail hands packed the hall, men in wool coats and women in calico dresses moving in rough time to music from a small band. The air felt hot and close from the press of bodies and the heat thrown by a pot-belly stove in the corner. Whiskey bottles lined the back bar. A haze of tobacco smoke hung below the ceiling, trapping the sour smell of sweat and stale beer. Clay and John Allison pushed through the swing doors already drunk from hours on the trail and in smaller saloons. Spurs clinked, and their hats sat at angles that signaled a mood for trouble. A town ordinance required visitors to check their pistols when they came inside, but the brothers kept their revolvers. Bent County Constable Charles Faber had already spoken to them once that evening, telling them plainly that they needed to hand over their guns if they planned to stay in town. They brushed him off and kept walking. Inside the Olympic, Clay moved toward the bar while John took to the dance floor. John grabbed partners roughly, spinning women faster than the music and stepping on feet without apology. When a husband objected, John laughed in his face. Clay leaned against the bar, drinking straight whiskey and watching with a cold grin as tempers rose. Several townsmen left the hall and crossed the street in search of the law. Every time John cut between couples, the music faltered before starting again, the band trying to keep the crowd calm. Constable Faber returned a short time later with a 10-gauge shotgun in his hands and 2 hastily deputized men at his back. The night air still clung to his coat when he stepped through the door. Someone in the crowd saw the shotgun's dull barrels and shouted a warning. The music stopped. John turned toward the sound, still breathing hard from dancing. Faber did not call for a surrender. He shouldered the shotgun and pulled the trigger with the barrel centered on John Allison's chest. The blast slammed into John and folded him backward. Buckshot tore through his coat and shirt, punched into flesh, and scattered lead through his chest and arm. He went down onto the boards in a spray of blood and splinters. Women screamed and threw themselves toward walls or under tables. Clay jerked away from the bar at the first shot. Even as Faber's second barrel swung back into line, Clay's hand found his revolver. Shots cracked faster than the band's drummer had beaten time. Clay fired 4 times in quick succession, the reports hammering inside the close hall. Men dropped flat or dived for cover as bullets whipped through the haze above the floor. One round hit Faber in the chest. The constable's shotgun went off as he fell, sending another blast wild into the room and peppering John's legs with more shot. Faber hit the floor near his deputies, the shotgun skidding from his hand as his body stopped moving. The 2 special deputies who had marched in at Faber's side saw the gunfighter with smoking revolver and their constable dead. They chose flight over a last stand. Chairs overturned as they scrambled for the doorway and into the street, their own pistols still holstered. Clay fired at them through the open entrance, his bullets smashing glass and digging splinters from the frame. But the men reached darkness and cover beyond the lamplight. Inside the Olympic, the music had stopped, replaced by ragged breathing and sobbing voices. Clay stepped across the floor toward his brother, boots leaving bloody prints where shot and splintered boards mixed with spilled whiskey. John lay gasping, eyes unfocused, chest and legs seeping through torn cloth. Clay stood for a heartbeat between John and Faber's body, his face set and expressionless. He nudged the constable's shoulder with a boot to confirm the man no longer moved, then holstered his revolver and knelt by his brother. People watched from the edges of the room, pressed back against walls, unsure whether to move or stay still. News of the killing reached Bent County officials within minutes. Lawmen collected whatever nerve remained, formed a new posse and came for the Allison brothers before dawn. Clay did not run. He knew witnesses would testify that Faber had fired first into a crowded dance hall, hitting a man who had not drawn a gun. He and John surrendered their weapons when a larger force arrived, recognizing that even a quick hand could not defeat shotguns and rifles trained from multiple angles inside a jail yard. Under guard, Clay watched as doctors picked buckshot from John's torn flesh and tried to keep infection from setting in. In the days that followed, Los Animas buzzed with voices that categorized the shooting every way possible. Some said Faber died doing his duty, standing up to a notorious gunfighter. Others said he had charged into a hall full of civilians with a shotgun and no warning, and that Allison's response met the rough standard of frontier justice. Regardless of opinion, one fact stayed clear. A lawman now lay in the ground, killed by a man whose name already soaked newspaper columns from Kansas to New Mexico. Clay Allison faced a manslaughter charge in Colorado courts for the Olympic Hall shooting, but the case did not end in a prison term. Witnesses described Faber's shotgun blast striking first and without formal attempt at arrest. Jurors and judges had already read stories of Allison's earlier lynchings and gunfights, yet in this instance the law accepted that he had fired in response to an immediate threat to his brother's life. The charges fell away and the record closed with Faber's death listed as another gunshot casualty in a territory crowded with them. By the time Clay left Colorado, the pattern of his life had hardened. In Cimarron, he had destroyed a press that printed words he hated, then handed over money as if that payment balanced a riverbed full of twisted iron and drowned type. In Los Animas, he had watched his brother drop under a blast of buckshot, then killed the man who had pulled the trigger, only to walk free again because jurors measured his actions against the moment rather than the long trail of bodies behind him. Editors, politicians, and law officers across the West read those outcomes as a warning. When Clay Allison drank and took offense, nothing in his path stayed safe for long, whether it was a printing press, a vigilante target, or a sworn peace officer standing under saloon lamps with a shotgun in his hands. The spring wind that pushed across the Canadian river country in 1877 carried dust, smoke, and fear. In Cimarron, people remembered Cruz Vega kicking in the air at the end of a rope, Pancho Griego dead on the saloon floor, and Deputy Charles Faber dropping with a bullet through his body in distant Los Animas. Those names stacked up in every conversation that mentioned Clay Allison. The man who laughed in the middle of killings still rode the streets, still drank at the St. James, still watched every stranger who stepped off the stage with a stare that made sober men look away. The Army had its own memories. On March 24th of the previous year, 3 black troopers of the 9th United States Cavalry had fallen in a gunfight with Texas cowboys near Fort Union. Privates George Small, Anthony Harvey, and John Hanson lay in the dirt with their blood soaking into New Mexico soil while one wounded comrade tried to drag himself clear. Within days, a rumor spread through the barracks that one of the cowboys was Clay Allison. By the time the story had been repeated from troop to troop, the tale claimed he had walked into a bar and calmly shot down a black sergeant and 4 soldiers before stepping back into the street. That lie fit everything men thought they knew about the rancher from Cimarron. Officers who had seen the wrecked newspaper office after Allison's rampage considered the rumor plausible without asking many questions. White ranch hands who disliked the presence of black soldiers in the territory repeated the story with a grin. The widows in the 9th Cavalry camps heard the name Allison spoken with a hatred usually reserved for men in Ku Klux Klan sheets. The killings themselves horrified the territory. The suggestion that a white gunfighter from the Colfax County War had guided the murderers turned that horror into something harder and colder. In the spring of 1877, mounted men rode into Cimarron with a different version of that story in their saddlebags. They carried orders to arrest Clay Allison as an accessory to the killing of the 3 black soldiers. The town watched from porches and boardwalks as soldiers and civilian officers walked toward the St. James Hotel. Inside, the bar smelled of spilled whiskey, wood smoke, and old cigar ash. Allison stood near the back wall with his hat pushed low and his pistol hanging easy at his side. He listened as the senior officer read out the charge, and then, to the surprise of several men waiting for a sudden gunfight, he nodded once, unbuckled his belt, and laid the revolver on the counter. The ride south to Fort Union passed through rolling grass and spring mud. At every stop, guards stayed alert, because the man in irons had a documented history of sudden violence when drink or temper caught him wrong. This time he said little. He watched the land he knew sliding past the wagon wheels, the volcanic ridges, cut banks, and cottonwood groves where he had grazed cattle and hunted rustlers. In the guardhouse at Fort Union, he listened as officers and lawyers asked the same question in different ways. Where were you when the 9th Cavalrymen died? Who rode with you that day? Who ordered the shots? The evidence collapsed under its own weight. Witnesses contradicted one another. Dates shifted under cross-examination. Men who had claimed to see Allison at the scene now admitted they had only heard his name afterward. The surviving trooper from the gunfight did not identify him. Documents that looked clear in the first reading blurred on the second. After days of questioning, an officer told Allison that the government had no solid proof he had been there at all. The formal charge still sat on the table, but the colonel who read it understood that any attempt to carry the case into a full trial would fracture in court. Allison walked out of Fort Union without a conviction, but not without consequence. Newspapers that carried the first rumor did not print a matching correction. The black soldiers' widows never heard a clear statement clearing his name. Among officers in New Mexico territory, his reputation hardened into something even more dangerous than before. He was no longer only the man who killed Kennedy, Colbert, Vega, Griego, and Faber. He was also the name linked to 3 murdered Buffalo soldiers in official paperwork, even if the case collapsed. That unseen stain followed him everywhere he rode in the months that followed. Those same months brought changes that had nothing to do with courts or colonels. The Colfax County War drained energy out of Cimarron. Investors pressed their claims through courts and hired guns. Settlers dug in around their homesteads. The Santa Fe ring continued to reach into every dispute that touched land and cattle. Underneath all of that, the Allison Ranch did the ordinary work of a range outfit. Herds needed tending, fences needed repairs where there were any fences at all, and men needed paying. Clay Allison rode out at dawn and came back after dark with dust covering his coat and temper simmering only a little below the surface. He recognized that he now drew heat from every direction. The territorial government considered him a ringleader of violence in Colfax County. Army officers viewed him as a disturber of the peace. Even some neighboring ranchers who once admired his readiness to stand up to the Santa Fe ring now worried his name would draw troops into any dispute near his range. In 1878, he solved that problem in the simplest way he knew. He sat down at a rough wooden table with his younger brother John, signed papers that transferred his profitable New Mexico ranch to John for $700, and began making preparations to leave the Canadian River Valley. Cattle trails ran north toward Kansas, and money waited there for anyone who could move beeves from Texas grass to the stockyards along the rail lines. Allison understood cattle as well as any man who had ever ridden behind them. He had worked for Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, had crossed rivers in the dark while longhorns shoved and turned under him, had slept in wet blankets under thunderstorms. When he rode north again, he did it as both trail boss and deadly escort. Men who signed on with him knew his history. They trusted him to deliver beef to the railheads, but they also knew that if whiskey and insult crossed his path, the night could end in gunfire. Dodge City in 1878 lived on that tension. The town clung to the edge of the buffalo grass, full of saloons with piano music, gambling rooms packed with hungry men, and the stockyards that gave meaning to the place. Cattle poured in from Texas and money poured out through faro tables and bar counters. Lawmen and gamblers mixed with drovers in streets that stank of manure and smoke. When word moved down the trail that Clay Allison was coming in with a bunch of Texans, people in Dodge paid attention. His reputation reached the town before his horses did. He rode in with a small group of cowboys who had pushed a herd up the trail. Their clothes carried dust and sweat from weeks on the move. Revolvers hung from their belts and cartridge belts crossed their hips. In town, those men learned that some of their companions had been roughed up by local officers who were tired of drunken Texans bringing their range habits into the dance halls and back alleys. Allison listened to the complaints in a smoky room above one of the saloons. As the men described boots, fists, and broken teeth, his expression tightened. The idea that someone else had laid hands on his riders without paying a price cut into him more deeply than any editorial or court summons. Word spread that he meant to answer that insult with his own hands. Dodge City had seen many gunmen, but the combination of his killings in New Mexico, the Las Animas bloodshed, and the rumor of the Buffalo Soldiers' murders gave this situation a different weight. Local merchants did not want a pitched gun battle in their streets. Officers who knew his reputation did not relish facing him in a narrow doorway with revolvers drawn. Cattle buyers worried that a shootout would close the town to trail herds for weeks. Even hardened gamblers lowered their voices as they watched the tension building between the Texans and the badge carriers. The showdown that formed out of that pressure did not match the tales that later sold newspapers. There was no roaring speech in the main street, no duel at high noon. Instead, on a cool evening, Allison and his cowboys gathered near a saloon with the easy name of the Long Branch. They wore pistols, and their eyes tracked every man with a star on his vest who came within sight. In another corner of town, Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson considered how to handle the situation. But when the meeting finally happened, other men stepped between the two sides. Dick McNulty, a cattleman who understood the value of a season's work, and Chalk Beeson, the saloon owner whose livelihood depended on a steady flow of customers, walked into the middle of that gathering with their hands spread and voices calm. They spoke to Allison not as officers but as fellow men of the range and the gambling table. McNulty pointed toward the stockyards and reminded everyone how much money sat on four legs in the pens. Beeson talked about keeping Dodge open for business, not closing it under sheets covering bodies in the street. While they talked, cowboys shifted on their feet, eyes flicking from one face to another. Allison did not back down in a public, dramatic way. He did something that frightened some men in town even more. He listened, the same mind that had decided to put his pistol on the bar in Cimarron rather than start a hopeless gunfight weighed the cost and benefit of pulling triggers in Dodge. He had already seen what happened when his name appeared in headlines. He did not fear dying, but he understood that killing local lawmen over a beating would only tighten the net already half woven around him by judges and army officers. After a long silence, he unbuckled his gun belt and handed it over. One by one, his cowboys did the same. The crisis passed without a shot, but the memory stayed. Lawmen in Dodge City told the story their own way, some placing themselves at the center of the scene, others remembering that the real work of diffusing the standoff had belonged to civilians. Cowboys repeated a different version, one in which Allison had come close to cleaning out the town and then chosen to hold back at the last instant. Through both versions, one fact remained steady. When Clay Allison walked into a saloon with anger in his eyes, everyone present understood that death could step through the door beside him at any time. After that trip, he left Kansas cattle towns behind and turned his full attention to Texas. In 1878, he moved onto land near the junction of Gageby Creek and the Washita River in what was then Wheeler County. The country there rolled in open swells of grass broken by draws, cottonwood lines, and occasional sandstone bluffs. Herds could graze across miles without a fence. The wind carried few sounds besides the lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon axles, and coyotes calling at night. Allison and his brothers registered an Ace brand and built up a herd that spread across the open range. Mobeetie sat near that range as a cluster of frame buildings, dugouts, and tents gathered around a military post and a few stores. Soldiers, buffalo hunters, freighters, and cowhands all came through. The place knew violence from Kiowa and Comanche raids, from brawls between white hunters, and from simple drunken quarrels that escalated to gunfire in seconds. When word spread that Clay Allison had taken up ranching nearby, local residents understood that another source of unpredictable trouble had just settled in their neighborhood. Some men welcomed the idea that such a fighter stood between them and rustlers or raiders. Others wondered whether his presence would draw more danger than it repelled. Age and routine did not erase the streak that had marked his life from Tennessee to New Mexico. In Mobeetie, townspeople watched him shift between quiet, almost courtly manners and sudden eruptions of temper. He served on juries, sitting in judgment on other men who had drawn pistols or knives. He bought supplies in the general store with the same coins he used to pay for whiskey in the saloons. He also drank hard enough that the barkeeps watched his eyes for a certain glassy shine that meant fists or bullets might follow the next insult. One story from those years showed exactly how easily his behavior could swing from something that looked like rough humor to something that humiliated other people when he drank. On a scorching day, he mounted his horse wearing nothing but boots, hat, and gun belt, then rode down Mobeetie's main street yelling that drinks were free for anyone who followed him to the bar. Women on porches pulled their children inside. Men stopped in doorways, torn between uneasy laughter and real fear. The sheriff, pushed by complaints from townspeople who expected some standard of public order, stepped into the street and shouted for Allison to dismount and hand over his weapon. The response came in a blur. Allison spurred his horse past the sheriff, circled at the far end of the street, and came back at a gallop. Dust rolled under the animal's hooves. When he reached the Lawmen, he slid from the saddle, snatched the revolver from his own holster, and jammed the barrel into the sheriff's ribs. The outlaw who had faced down lynch mobs and constables marched the embarrassed officer through the swinging doors of the nearest saloon. Inside, with townspeople pressed against the walls, he forced the sheriff to drink glass after glass of liquor until the man sagged against the bar. No shots were fired, but the damage ran deeper than broken glass. The episode humiliated the local law in front of everyone. Young cowhands watching from the doorway understood that the badge did not protect a man from a mood swing in Allison's head. Older residents saw that his impulses could now turn toward mocking and degrading officials, instead of simply killing enemies in compromising situations. The next time a fight broke out in town, the sheriff carried that memory with him. The feel of a cold gun barrel in his side and the laughter of the crowd ringing in his ears. Allison's ranching years in Texas also drew him into the border conflict between cattlemen and Comanche bands who still moved through the panhandle. Reports spread through the region of a siege at a small homestead on the open prairie. A family huddled behind wagon boxes and hastily dug earthworks while mounted raiders circled them. Allison heard the story in a trading post and did what he had done his entire adult life when violence called. He gathered a group of riders, checked his pistols, and pushed out across the plains. When they found the homestead, the raiders scattered under a sudden charge, leaving one dead on the ground and empty space where others had ridden moments before. The rescued family saw a man whose arrival ended a one-sided assault that had been close to killing them all. The cowhands who rode with him saw again how calm he could be while bullets whistled past. Among the Comanche who survived, the story spread of a white rancher who pursued them with as much determination as any cavalry captain. In each version, justice and revenge both appeared, and people who told the events later could not say where one stopped and the other began. By the early 1880s, Allison owned cattle, land, and a solid standing among ranchers along the Washita. That reality did not erase the line of bodies behind him. Men in Mobeetie still glanced twice when he stepped into a room. Buffalo soldiers who read old clippings still saw his name written over the graves of 3 dead comrades. Lawmen in Dodge City and Los Animas remembered near disasters tied to his moods. In the Texas Panhandle, his new nickname, the Wolf of the Washita, summarized the same idea that had followed him from Tennessee fields to New Mexico saloons. He could spend months running cattle, serving on juries and sharing drinks without drawing a weapon. But when alcohol, insult, or anger reached a certain point, he shifted without warning from calm conversation to deadly action. February 15, 1881, cold air blew in hard gusts across Mobeetie when Robert Clay Allison stood beside America Medora, Dora McCulloch, in a plain frontier ceremony. The town that had watched him ride half-naked through its main street now watched him take a wife in a small room near the post, with a minister, a few witnesses, and the stamp of the county on the paper. Dora came from Sedalia, Missouri, dark-haired, steady-eyed, used to railroad smoke and boarding houses. She faced the man whose name reached from Kansas cowtowns to New Mexico canyons and agreed to tie her life to his. Outside, horses shifted at the rails and soldiers walked their rounds while the couple spoke the words that turned a gunfighter and a ranch hand into a husband. After the ceremony, they rode out to the ranch at the junction of Gageby Creek and the Washita River. The house stood low against the wind, built of logs and rough boards, with a stone chimney and a view of open grass in every direction. A corral held saddle horses and a handful of milk cows. The Ace brand burned into cattle hides on the range marked the brothers' claim on that country. Clay now rode out each morning with more than cattle on his mind. He thought of the woman who waited in the house, of the promise he had made to her before the minister, and of the child she told him she hoped to carry. Days settled into a new pattern. Before sunrise, he drank coffee at the small table Dora kept clear of clutter and ate food she had cooked instead of meals from a saloon kitchen. He rode fence lines and water holes, checked for sign of rustlers or raiders, and spent more time measuring grass than watching other men's hands. At night, he came home to lamplight, not to the blind noise of a packed bar room. Yet the man who stacked wood by the door and brought fresh water from the creek was the same one who had left bodies under telegraph poles and on saloon floors. Visitors to the ranch saw both sides. Some days they found him quiet, speaking softly to Dora, holding his temper in check when a hired man broke a tool or misplaced a saddle. On other days, the old edge showed in his eyes. A small slight, a remark that he thought carried disrespect or the wrong tone from a passing stranger could still bring his jaw tight. He kept his pistols close at hand. The gun stayed oiled and loaded on a peg near the door or on the shelf beside the bed. Dora watched those moods and learned to steer conversation away from old grudges when his hands began to flex without him knowing it. Mobeetie learned to read the new version of him as well. He still came into town for supplies and whiskey. He still leaned against the bar with one heel hooked on the brass rail, listening to every word, weighing every man. But now he sometimes had his wife on his arm. When he brought her into the general store, he kept his voice calm, helped carry the bundles, and tipped his hat to women he had once ignored. Townspeople who had known him only as the man who had once marched their sheriff into a saloon at gunpoint now saw him paying cash for calico and flour. The two images never fit easily, but both were true. In the early 1880s, he and his brothers decided that the Washita place no longer suited their plans. Pressure on the open range grew as more herds filled the panhandle. New outfits pushed in from the east. Trails shifted. Clay sold his interest and moved southwest toward the Pecos country, where water and grass still stretched wide and where a man with experience could carve out another spread. By 1883, he had taken up a ranch near Pope's Wells, on the line between Texas and New Mexico, using Pecos as his supply town. The land there looked different from the Washita. Mesquite and greasewood dotted the flats. The Pecos River cut a dark, twisting line through the country, its banks choked with brush in places where cattle came to drink. Summer heat rolled hard across the flats and dust coated everything that moved. Clay and Dora set up a small rock house near the trail, 2 rooms with a plank floor and a view of the low hills. He spent long days pushing cattle across dry draws, always measuring how much graze remained, how far to the next water. Domestic life edged into his days whether he wanted it or not. In August 1885, Dora gave birth to their first daughter, Patty Dora, in Cimarron, New Mexico. The town where he had once walked with a rope over his shoulder and a lynch mob at his back now saw him as a father. People who remembered public hangings and bodies on barroom floors watched him carry a newborn wrapped in cloth through dusty streets on a visit, his hand surprisingly gentle on the child's back. For a short time, the man who had been the terror of Colfax County walked past the same buildings as just another husband trying to keep his family moving between ranches and markets. Work did not slow. Cattle still had to reach railheads and money still waited in northern stockyards. In 1886, he went north again with a herd, this time into Wyoming country. Cheyenne grew at the edge of the plains with stock pens, railroad sidings, and brick buildings that held banks, hotels, and professionals who served the trade. One of those professionals sat in an upstairs room with a chair, a tray of instruments, and a spittoon in the corner, ready to work on trail-damaged teeth. Clay climbed those stairs one day with a jaw that throbbed every time cold water hit it. Trail dust had ground into his gums, and a bad molar stabbed pain up the side of his face whenever he bit down on hard food. Inside the office, the smell of antiseptic mixed with cigar smoke. The dentist, in a vest and rolled shirt sleeves, checked his tools and told Allison to sit. Clay settled his weight into the chair, set his hat on his lap, and opened his mouth while the man leaned in with a mirror and probe. The examination ended with a decision: to drill and fill one tooth. Pain flared as the bit cut into enamel. Allison gripped the wooden arms of the chair and stared at a spot on the ceiling while the dentist worked. The sound of metal on tooth scraped through his skull. As the minutes stretched, he realized something was wrong. The pain came from a different tooth than the one that had been troubling him. When the dentist stepped back and said the job was done, Clay tested his bite and felt the same raw stab from the untouched molar. The man had drilled the wrong tooth. Rage rose through him in a straight, hard line. He stood from the chair without a word, walked to the tray of instruments and picked up a pair of forceps. The dentist tried to explain, hands raised, words tumbling from his mouth. Clay clamped the forceps around one of the man's front teeth and pulled. Bone and gum tore. Blood filled the dentist's mouth and ran down his chin. A second yank threatened another tooth before screams from the office brought men running up the stairs from the street. They found Allison with the forceps still in his hand. The professional who had drilled the wrong molar slumped in the chair, clutching his face, eyes wide with pain and terror. It took several men to separate them and push Clay out onto the hallway. He walked away from that room with the original molar still aching and a fresh example of how his anger landed on the bodies of people who made mistakes near him. The dentist lived, but the broken tooth and the memory stayed with him. Cheyenne carried the story into its bar rooms and depot waiting rooms. Trail drivers repeated it down the line, another proof that this man punished insults and incompetence with direct physical damage, even when no gunfire erupted and no one died. Back on the Pecos Ranch, family life pushed forward. Dora managed the house, the small garden, and the accounts, stretching every dollar he brought in from cattle sales. Patty grew into a strong toddler, unsteady on the rocky ground near the house, but already reaching for the reins when someone put her on a calm horse. Clay spent more nights at home, more hours mending harness and checking wagon wheels himself. People who saw him in Pecos during those years remarked that he had thickened with age, that the wild light in his eyes dimmed when he held his daughter. Yet they also knew that whiskey could still bring it back without warning. July 3, 1887 began as a workday. Clay hitched a team to a heavily loaded wagon in Pecos, piling it with sacks of grain, barrels, and other supplies needed on the ranch 40 miles to the north. The sun climbed, heating the boards and iron. He checked the harness, tightened the ropes that held the cargo in place, and took the driver's seat. As the team pulled the wagon out of town, the iron rims rattled over stones in the street, then settled into the rhythm of the dirt road leading toward his land. The route lay over uneven ground cut by arroyos and low rises. Dust rose behind the wheels. The team leaned into the traces as the wagon eased up a slope, then jolted as it dropped into a shallow wash. Somewhere along that rough stretch, the load shifted. A heavy sack of grain near the top slid toward the open side, its weight dragging other bundles with it. Clay saw the movement and stood to grab it before it fell. In that instant, the front wheels met another rut. The jolt snapped the wagon forward. Off balance and reaching, he lost his footing on the worn boards. He fell from the seat, striking the side of the wagon as he went down. The team, feeling the slack and then the jerk of the shifting weight, lurched ahead. As he hit the ground, his body dropped under the rear wheel. Wood rim and iron tire rolled up onto his shoulder and across his neck with the full force of the loaded wagon behind it. Bone gave way. The weight crushed vertebrae and skull in a single grinding pass. The team dragged the wagon a short distance before slowing, confused without a driver's hands on the lines. On that stretch of road, there were no nearby houses, no saloons, no crowds to gather at the sound of trouble. By the time another traveler came along the track and found the wrecked load and the body beside the wheel ruts, the work of the accident was finished. Clay Allison, who had walked out of gunfights and lynch mobs, who had survived a self-inflicted shot through his foot and countless nights of heavy drinking, lay dead on the dirt, killed by a shift in freight and a moment's lost balance. News reached Pecos fast. Riders brought word into town that the rancher from the north lay beside his toppled load. Men who had bought cattle from him and drunk with him at the bar shook their heads and saddled fresh horses. They brought the body back to town, washed it, and set it out for viewing. People filed past the table to see the face that had filled so many stories. Women who had heard only of his rages studied the lines in his features and saw a tired, middle-aged man. Old soldiers remembered printed accounts that had linked his name to lynchings and cavalry graves, and wondered how their dead would have judged this ending. The next day, they buried him in the Pecos cemetery. The July sun beat down on rows of simple markers and the small crowd that gathered between them. Ranchers, townspeople, and passing drummers from the railroad town stood together while a minister read from his Bible. Dora faced the open grave with Patty at her side and another child already growing inside her. Beneath her feet, dirt weighted over a man who had brought death to others with steady hands and who now lay in the ground by simple accident. 7 months later, Dora delivered their second daughter. They named her Clay Pearl. The girl never saw her father alive. Her memories of him came from other people's mouths, from hard stories told in low voices, from newspaper clippings, and from the carved stone that marked his resting place. A few years later, Dora married again and moved to Fort Worth, Texas, taking the girls into a new life where their father's name meant money in dime novels but pain in family talk. In 1975, long after every witness to his violence and his death had gone into the ground, the town of Pecos reinterred his remains in a park near the museum. Civic leaders placed a new marker at the grave. One stone listed his name, his service in the 9th Tennessee Cavalry, and the dates that framed his life. Another carried the line that had followed him across the plains and into legend, the sentence friends had quoted when they tried to explain what he had done. He never killed a man that did not need killing. Visitors reading those words in the hot Texas light saw only what the stone allowed. The rest of the truth lay in court records, inquests, and the memories of families who lost husbands, brothers, and sons when his temper flared. Some of those men had drawn first. Some had walked into confrontations with weapons in hand. Others had met him under circumstances they did not control, caught at the wrong end of a rope or at the wrong table in a saloon. His death under a wagon wheel did not erase their graves or the bruises and fractures left on people who survived his outbursts. The phrase on his stone turned his record into a claim of clean necessity, but the trail from Tennessee to Texas showed a different pattern, one in which drink, pride, and a damaged mind met firearms and weak law until an accident on a dusty road finally stopped a man who had frightened lawmen and outlaws in equal measure.